Dear public, dear everyone, it's a very great pleasure for me to welcome at the Slavic Studies Institute Eric NAIMAN, professor at UC Berkeley, and Victoire FEUILLEBOIS, professor at Strasbourg University. That's okay, we're live people.
Thank you for the promotion.
And the Institut Universitaire de France, who are here today to give out a double conference, a double talk on reading Tolstoy in the 20th and 21st century. This idea has emerged in a very happy coincidental way. Eric suggested to give a talk on Tolstoy read by Nabokov, reading Proust. And I thought of Victoire, of course, who is the specialist of Tolstoy read by other writers and critics in the 20th century. And so we decided to do this conference workshop-like team up. And Eric will talk first, and then Victoire, and then they will comment on each other's papers, and then we will be able to ask them questions and pursue the discussion. So, Eric, the floor is yours. You have all the time in the world because we have 3 hours until 6. And then Victoire.
All right. Thank you very much, Daria, and thank you for the invitation. And it's been a pleasure putting this together with you and Victoire. Just a few things about the project from which this comes. It's a book that's almost finished. That is about, with the very boring preliminary title of Working Through Nabokov, but it's taking Nabokov's views of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and either arguing with him or taking his ideas further, using him as a kind of jumping off point. In addition, each of the sections, the Dostoevsky and the Tolstoy section, go from kind of more traditional philological work to more speculative chapters. This, I think, is actually on the more traditional side, but you can judge for yourself. It's an honor to be presenting this in this talk in France. I've given earlier versions of this talk at Reed College and Wesleyan College in the US and at Oxford. I've incorporated some of the suggestions I've gotten there. As someone who has loved Proust for a long time, I have too much passion for his language to pronounce it to a French audience. So Victoire has agreed to read the quotations when we get to them. Most of the quotations will be in French. I have a couple short ones in English. Okay. Tolstoy starts to fade, repurposed epiphanies in Nabokov and Proust. Opposite the title page of Vladimir Nabokov's teaching copy of Swann's Way, preserved in his archive at the New York Public Library, there is an inscription in Nabokov's hand that opens the text and serves as an epigraph for the entire volume. It goes as follows: appeared at the end of 1913, 3 years after Tolstoy's death. That's an odd anniversary to mark. In his lectures, Nabokov would often link up the previous text he had taught to the one upon which the class was embarking, but he did not teach Tolstoy and Proust in the same course. Yet the placing of this inscription as the opening of his copy of Proust reflects something crucial for Nabokov. It's a statement out of which tumbles, virtually replacing the Madeleine, his entire reading of Proust. In Nabokov's marginal notes and in the lectures to which they would lead, it is as though Tolstoy keeps elbowing his way into Proust's text, distracting the professor's attention. Nabokov writes A.K. for Anna Karenina when Swann's father is described as habitually passing his hand over his forehead, drying his eyes and wiping his glasses in order not to deal with moral compunctions, a gesture that recalls Anna's squinting away ethical concerns. But some of the connections to Tolstoy seem rather far-fetched. At one point, when the intensely jealous Swann justifies bribery and eavesdropping as necessary to the search for truth about his lover's affairs, Nabokov underlines the search for truth and writes Tolstoy, discerning a similarity which, if intentional, could only be parodic. At moments like this, Nabokov seems to be imitating Proust's penchant for, as Philippe Chardin puts it, the most acrobatic forms of comparison, those which reject the prevailing positivist methodology that focused on the documentation of sources and influences, and which threatened to deprive works of their essential genius, of their, or their essence. The emphatic marking of Tolstoy's death as the entry point to Proust's masterpiece can be understood in several not necessarily mutually exclusive ways. On one hand, it can herald a change of epoch, the switch to a new literary aesthetic from realism to modernism. Yet because Nabokov was not fond of realism as a term for works of literary value, he was given to emphasizing the way in which Tolstoy had anticipated modernism, stressing, for example, that the portrayal of Anna Karenina's stream of consciousness as she walks toward her death was a forerunner of Ulysses. The mention of Tolstoy's death at the start of the Recherche could be taken, therefore, as an assertion of the Russian writer's priority, or perhaps of Proust's belatedness. Finally, and more speculatively, given Nabokov's interest in the other world, the world beyond, and his penchant for works like the Vane Sisters, Pale Fire, and in works like the Vane Sisters, Pale Fire, and Transparent Things, for drafting ghosts as covert narrators, one can see that inscription as an incantation, calling on Tolstoy's spirit to become a reincarnated, collaborative presence in Proust. What I propose to do in my talk today, after surveying some of the most important points of Proust and Nabokov's contiguity and their grounding in Tolstoy, is to look at one of the places where Nabokov sought especially hard to portray Tolstoy's work as an anticipation of Proust's. I think Nabokov missed the mark there, but missed it so closely as to draw attention to an unexpected Tolstoyan layer beneath one of the Recherche's most crucial epiphanic scenes. That scene, furthermore, opens up a new perspective on Lolita as a parody or purposely flawed imitation of Proust's reworking of Tolstoy, but I won't get to this last point about Lolita today. For Nabokov, the question of Proust's relation to Tolstoy had its roots in debates that had occurred 2 decades earlier among writers of the Russian emigration. When the Russian émigré journal Numbers surveyed Russian writers in 1930 about the importance of Proust to the future of Russian literature, Nabokov declined to play along, disparaging the pedantic tone of the question. Other respondents were more willing to talk. According to the novelist Mark Aldanov, there hasn't been a psychologist in world literature equal to Proust since the death of Tolstoy, to whom, by the way, Proust owes a great deal. The poet and critic Georgy Ivanov, however, was less sanguine. Proust, he urged, could be used as a test to measure the vitality of Russia's greatest writers. Stand Gogol up to Proust, Ivanov wrote, and Gogol remains Gogol. Lermontov remains Lermontov, and Tyutchev stays Tyutchev. But with Tolstoy, he wrote, something happens. Right in front of our eyes, Tolstoy ceases to shine. He withers and fades. It's a most unpleasant phenomenon. Ivanov was one of Nabokov's bitterest enemies in the emigration, and one can see in Nabokov's reading of Proust an attempt to push back against Ivanov's claims of Tolstoy's withering and fading, to turn up the Tolstoyan illumination in his analysis of Proust's work. Complicating Nabokov's intervention in the question of Tolstoy's legacy after Proust was Nabokov's own anxieties about the closeness of his indebtedness towards the French writer. The question of Proust's influence on Nabokov had been raised by émigré critics. In 1937, one of them had claimed that, unlike Tolstoy, Nabokov had passed his own version of the Proust test. Nabokov is the only Russian writer who has accepted Proust with his ability to focus, as though using a microscope, on the smallest impressions, those which hardly make it to our consciousness. Proust has influenced many writers, often to bad effect, but only Nabokov has accepted him organically and has learned from him without any damage to his unique nature. Interviewed a few years before his death, Nabokov insisted that he had not read Proust until 1935, at which point, as he put it, he was fully formed as a writer and was thus immune to outside influences. We now know, however, from his correspondence with his wife, that he was already reading Albertine Disparue in 1926, so presumably he had read all the preceding volumes by then. There does seem to be an increased intensity of engagement with Proust in the mid-1930s when Nabokov is writing The Gift, and his translation of Laughter in the Dark contains Proustian references not in the original Russian Camera Obscura, written earlier in the decade. By the late 1940s, when Nabokov is simultaneously preparing his first Proust lectures and working on Lolita and his memoir, Speak Memory, the engagement becomes particularly intense. We can see this engagement all over his fiction. Lolita, Ada, and The Gift are the books with the deepest investment in the recherche. Humbert, after all, refers to Lolita as his prisoner and says his book might be called Dolores Disparue, thus riffing on the titles of the two penultimate volumes of Proust's saga. The adjective Proustian is frequently applied to Nabokov's memoir, Speak Memory. In the long run, however, the little things, specific conceits, images, and devices that Nabokov took from Proust may be more important in charting the contours of the decades-long conversation between them. These include the trick of dangling at the start of a book the married name of a crucial female character that the reader cannot possibly yet recognize, but which, were the reader to retain it, would later deprive the plot of crucial surprises. The first fictional character named in Proust's novel is Madame de Saint-Loup, whom only much later will we associate with Gilberte. We are told on Lolita's second page that Mrs. Richard Schiller has died in childbirth. If we recognize that name 200 pages later, the end of the novel reads quite differently. These are details that jump out in all their salience the second time around, recalling Nabokov's dicta that one cannot read a book, one can only reread it. And I'm about to get to the first quotes from the French. If you do not know French and you're watching on Zoom or maybe on YouTube, the English translations will be there. Many of Nabokov's most programmatic statements on aesthetics dovetail with Proust's. Of the fictional writing Bergotte, Proust's narrator tells us as number one,
Quand Bergotte voulait dire du bien d'un livre, ce qu'il faisait valoir, ce qu'il citait, c'était toujours quelques scènes faisant image, quelques tableaux sans signification rationnelle. Ah si, disait-il, c'est bien, il y a une petite fille en châle orange. Ah, c'est bien.
This literary equivalent of locker room banter is exactly the tone struck between the fictitious writers Godunov-Tchernintsev and Konchaev in The Gift. How about Leskov's image of Jesus, the ghostly Galilean, cool and gentle, in a robe the color of ripening plum, or his description of a yawning dog's mouth with its bluish palate as if smeared with pomade? Bedlam turned back into Bethlehem, that's Dostoevsky for you, with one reservation. In the Karamazovs, there's somewhere a circular mark left on an outdoor table. That's worth saving if one uses your approach. Proust insisted that
Le génie artistique agit à la façon de ces températures extrêmement élevées qui ont le pouvoir de dissocier les combinaisons d'atomes et de grouper ceux-ci suivant un ordre absolument contraire, répondant à un autre type.
For Nabokov, the material of this world is chaos, and to this chaos the author says go, allowing the world to flicker and to fuse. It is now recombined in its very atoms, not merely in its visible and superficial parts. Perhaps more important, each claimed to privilege form over content, or to insist that form was, in effect, content. Proust's narrator says, number 3,
Ce que racontaient les gens m'échappait, car ce qui m'intéressait, c'était non ce qu'ils voulaient dire, mais la manière dont ils le disaient.
Nabokov's cousin, Zinaida Shakhovskaya, recorded in her memoir Nabokov's account of his meeting in the Café Flore with a Soviet writer sent to convince him to return home. Nabokov, who always scanned those around him for interesting details, noticed a patron at another table avidly reading a newspaper. Look how he is reading it. Смотрите, как он ее читает. The Soviet writer wanted to know the political tendency of the paper, and Nabokov responded, "That's why I cannot return. I care about how people read, and you care about what they read. Мне важно, как читают, а вам важно, что читают." The overlap between Nabokov and Proust becomes most intense when they are both dealing with Tolstoy. One of the most interesting points of this congruence comes when the writers discuss the mistaken impressions that prey upon the dying and the sick. Early in Swann's Way, the narrator considers the plight of the invalid who has been obliged to go off on a journey and has had to sleep in an unfamiliar hotel, and who, after a long night, is cheered to see a ray of light under the door. Number 4.
Quel bonheur, c'est déjà le matin. Dans un moment, les domestiques seront levés, il pourra sonner, on viendra lui porter secours. L'espérance d'être soulagé lui donne du courage pour souffrir. Justement, il a cru entendre des pas. Les pas se rapprochent, puis s'éloignent. Et l'arrêt de jour qui était sous sa porte a disparu. C'est minuit, on vient d'éteindre le gaz, le dernier domestique est parti, et il faudra rester toute la nuit à souffrir sans remède.
Nabokov makes a similar move when describing the death of Alexander Chernyshevsky in The Gift. The following day he died, but before that he had a moment of lucidity, complaining of pains and then saying it was darkish in the room because of the lowered blinds. What nonsense! Of course there is nothing afterwards. He sighed, listened to the trickling and drumming outside the window, and repeated with extreme distinctiveness, "There is nothing. It is as clear as the fact that it is raining." And meanwhile, outside, the spring sun was playing on the roof tiles, the sky was dreamy and cloudless, the tenant upstairs was watering the flowers on the edge of her balcony, and the water trickled down with a drumming sound. Nabokov is ironizing the moment of death rather than the coming of the dawn, and his source here might not be just that scene in Swann's Way, but more critically, the death of Bergotte. Bergotte is overtaken by a fear of death while attending an exhibition of works by Vermeer. Suddenly he stopped thinking that his life was in danger and said to himself, "It's just indigestion. Those potatoes were undercooked." He had a further stroke, rolled off the sofa onto the ground. He was dead. This moment is particularly poignant because Bergotte has gone to the exhibition in order to see a little patch of yellow wall in the view of Delft that he particularly liked. That admiration for a small detail is what brings him to his death. In the sort of twist Nabokov admired, Bergotte has been polished off by an ironic twist of poetic justice, in accordance with his own aesthetic principles. Nabokov greatly appreciated that Robert Louis Stevenson, dying of a burst blood vessel, cried out, "What's the matter with me? What is this strangeness? Has my face changed?" At the end of his Cornell lectures on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Nabokov added with delight, "There is a curious thematical link between this last episode in Stevenson's life and the fateful transformations in his most wonderful book." Nabokov had not only Proust as a model for Alexander Chernyshevsky's death, but also Tolstoy. Tolstoy's early story, Sevastopol in May, follows two soldiers into battle. When they come under fire, one thinks he has been killed, but is only slightly wounded. The other is relieved to have survived. "Thank God I'm only bruised," and conveys to the reader his grateful thoughts until we learn at the end of the paragraph he had been killed on the spot by a bomb splinter which had struck him in the middle of his chest. For the death of Bergotte, Proust has transferred this scene to a museum, perhaps because in his work, art is the primary battlefield. All three writers are mocking the epistemological certainty of characters and celebrating the superior insight of author and reader at the moment of the greatest human finality, death. Jean-Yves Tadier has suggested that we can hear Tolstoy's muffled hammer blows in the death of Bergotte, a literary kinsman of Ivan Ilyich. But it is probably a different, more ironic work by Tolstoy that Nabokov and Proust had in mind. We can't know with certainty that Proust read the Sevastopol stories, but that possibility is made much more likely by the scholar Anne Henry's suggestion that Proust had read a collection of Tolstoy's death scenes that appeared in 1886 under the title L'Amour. This book contained not only the first French publication of the death of Ivan Ilyich and the greatest death scenes of Anna Karenina and War and Peace, but also a short snippet from Sevastopol in May entitled Death on the Battlefield, which turns out to consist of only the scene I mentioned above. Nabokov seems to have grasped Proust's nod to Tolstoy, and in that scene from The Gift about the fake rain on the parade of Chernyshevsky's death, he inscribed himself into the possibility of their connection. Nabokov called the first half of the Recherche one of the 4 great works of fiction written in the 20th century, and his lectures on Proust are unalloyedly adulatory. So it comes as a surprise to see the extent of hostile animus with which Nabokov annotated his printed copy of Swann's Way. As he read, Nabokov had 3 rather aggressive preoccupations. 1, finding echoes of early writers, mostly Tolstoy. 2, identifying passages that he thought could only have been written by a homosexual. And 3, pointing out egregious translation errors. Occasionally, these missions blur into one another. On the title page, Nabokov wrote, "For some exquisite boners, see, for instance, page 171. In the early 50s, Nabokov may not have known the sexual, erectile meaning of that word, which also, and less vulgarly, refers to a stupid mistake. But since the passage in question is Marcel's lovingly phallic description of asparagus, Nabokov's use of the word appropriately highlights the glee and nearly sadistic pleasure with which Nabokov unmasked and mocked both homosexual writing and translators' mistakes. The 2 most frequent marginalia in Nabokov's volume of Proust, of Swann's Way, are idiot, for translator C.K. Scott Moncrief, and homosex, for passages revealing covert same-sex desire or where girls were acting in a way Nabokov thought likely only of boys. This isn't the only place where the proximity of translation to homosexuality clearly preoccupied him. Writing to a publisher in the 30s about the possibility of translating and bringing out The Gift, Nabokov jokingly insisted that he needed a man who knows English better than Russian, and a man, not a woman. I'm frankly homosexual on the subject of translators. On one hand, a focus on Proust's homosexuality was a method of foregrounding the differences between them, but it isn't clear which was primary, homophobia or the anxiety of influence. In the annotations, Tolstoy enters this constellation, and the overlap persists in the lectures on Proust in an intriguing way. Tolstoy was initially entirely absent from the lecture notes. At one point, though, Nabokov felt bound to make a note insisting on temporal precedence. He wrote, "Incidentally, the first homosexuals in modern literature are described in Anna Karenina, namely in chapter 19, part 2, where Vronsky is breakfasting in the mess room of his regiment. 2 officers are briefly but vividly described, and the description leaves no doubt about the relationship between these 2. This parenthetical comment was scribbled at the top of a page, an afterthought to the lecture Nabokov had already written out. So it's ironic that it has become probably the most quoted portion of the Proust lecture, in part because, as far as I know, prior to Nabokov, nobody had commented in print on those officers' sexual orientation. It may be, too, that Nabokov did not have that insight himself until he became hell-bent on uncovering all the homosexuals in the Recherche. Chardin writes that Proust's epic makes explicit the connection between jealousy and homosexuality that is only implicit in Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata, in the relation of Posnachev to Trukhachevsky, or, as we might add, in the homoerotic and homophobic undercurrents surrounding Lyovin's attitude to Vasenka Veslovsky in Anna Karenina. In fact, Nabokov had very little original to say about Proust, and the Proust lecture is in some respects his least insightful. Reviewing the posthumously published collection of lectures, Robert Alter singled the Proust lecture out as especially problematic, given Nabokov's extensive reliance on synopsis and quotation. There is also the question of his extensive reliance for biographical detail and interpretive summary on just one source, a 1940 book on Proust by Derek Léon. The afterthoughts about Tolstoy make the lecture more interesting. The most extensive of these comes at the point in the lecture where Nabokov has been analyzing for his Cornell students Proust's device of unfolding extended metaphors, which he distinguishes in their lyricism and cohesiveness from Gogol's absurd, rambling comparisons. He directs his class's attention to a passage from the first volume of the Recherche. Note how much ground is covered here. 5.
J'ouvris la fenêtre sans bruit et m'assis au pied de mon lit. Je ne faisais presque aucun mouvement afin qu'on ne m'entendît pas d'en bas. Dehors, les choses semblaient, elles aussi, figées en une muette attention à ne pas troubler le clair de lune, qui, doublant et reculant chaque chose par l'extension devant elle de son reflet, plus dense et concret qu'elle-même, avait à la fois aminci et agrandi le paysage, comme un plan replié jusque-là, qu'on développe. Ce qui avait besoin de bouger, quelques feuillages de marronnier, bougeait. Mais son frissonnement minutieux, total, exécuté jusque dans ses moindres nuances et ses dernières délicatesses, ne bavait pas sur tout le reste, ne se fondait pas avec lui, restait circonscrit. Exposé sur ce silence qui n'en absorbait rien, les bruits les plus éloignés, ceux qui devaient venir de jardins situés à l'autre bout de la ville, se percevaient détaillés avec un tel fini qu'il semblait ne devoir cet effet de lointain qu'à leur pianissimo, comme ces motifs en sourdine si bien exécutés par l'orchestre du conservatoire que, quoi qu'on n'en perde pas une note, on croit les entendre cependant loin de la salle du concert, et que tous les vieux abonnés, les sœurs de ma grand-mère aussi, quand Swann leur avait donné ses places, tendaient l'oreille, comme s'ils avaient été écoutés les progrès lointains d'une armée en marche qui n'aurait pas encore tourné la rue de Trévise.
Nabokov pays close attention to the way one Proustian simile unfolds from another, in a potentially endless succession of performatively imagined likenesses. What particularly interests him, however, is the peculiar way in which Proust's narrator, as he says, drifts from the idea of pale light to that of remote music. The sense of vision grades into the sense of hearing. He then adds an unexpected likeness of his own in a formulation that will be familiar to any reader who recalls even the second paragraph of Lolita. Did she have a precursor? She did, indeed she did. In his lecture, Nabokov tells his class, but Proust had a precursor. In Part 6, Chapter 2 of Tolstoy's War and Peace, Prince Andrei stays at the country manor of an acquaintance, Count Rostov. He cannot sleep. Prince Andrei left his bed and went up to the window. This is quoting Tolstoy in translation. Prince Andrei left his bed and went up to the window to open it. As soon as he had unfolded its shutters, the moonlight broke into the room as if he had been waiting a long time outside on the watch for such a chance. He opened the window. The night was cool and motionlessly luminous. The trim trees that stood in a row just in front of the window were black on one side and silvery bright on the other. Beyond them was some kind of roof, all shining with dew. On the right stood a great thick-leaved tree, its bole and branches a brilliant white, and overhead an almost full moon was riding the starless spring sky. Presently, this is back to Nabokov speaking, presently at the window of the floor above him he hears two young feminine voices. One of them belongs to Natasha Rostova, singing and repeating a musical phrase. A little later, Natasha leans out of that window above and he hears the rustle of her dress and the sound of her breathing, and the sounds become still like moon in the shadows. Nabokov continues, 3 things are to be noted in Tolstoy as 4 glimpses of Proust. 1. The expectancy of the moonlight lying in wait, a pathetic fallacy. Beauty ready to rush in, a fawning and dear creature at the moment it is perceived by the human mind. 2. The clear-cut quality of the description, a landscape firmly etched in silver and black, with no conventional phrases and with no borrowed moons. It is all real, authentic, sensuously seen. 3. The close association of the visible and the heard, of shadow light and shadow sound, of ear and eye. Compare these to the evolution of the image in Proust. Notice the elaboration of the moonlight in Proust, the shadows that come out of the light like the drawers of a chest, and the remoteness and the music. Nabokov is not insisting that Proust's passage is a conscious echo of Tolstoy's. He is merely insisting on a poetic affinity. And Nabokov's insistence on the similarity initially struck me as disappointing. Stylistically and thematically, these passages are so different. Yet I think Nabokov was onto something very important. This was a moment for Nabokov the scholar, similar to that experienced by Marcel at Balbec, where he is on the verge of an epiphany that will explain to him the profound beauty of a specific view, but he falls short of connecting what he has seen to the metonymic cause of its visual echo. Andrei's gaze out the window is located just adjacent to a scene in Tolstoy's novel that Proust crucially echoes. That scene on the balcony which becomes a moment of rebirth for Prince Andrei, is the central panel of a triptych. On his way to visit the Rostov family on business, Prince Andrei sees an old oak that does not seem to have been influenced by the new spring. Most of you probably know this scene by heart, but with its huge, gnarled, and ungainly, unsymmetrically spread arms and fingers, it stood old, angry, scornful, and ugly amidst the smiling birches. It alone did not want to submit to the charm of spring and did not want to see either the springtime or the sun. Spring and love and happiness, the oak seemed to say, and how is it you're not bored with the same stupid, senseless deception? Always the same and always a deception. There's no spring, no sun, no happiness. Look, there sit these smothered dead fir trees, always the same. Look at me spreading my broken flayed fingers wherever they grow. As they've grown, so I stand, and I don't believe in your hopes and deceptions. Yes, it's right, 1,000 times right, this oak, thought Prince Andrei. Let others, the young ones, succumb afresh to this deception, but we know life, our life is over. A whole new series of thoughts in connection with the oak, hopelessly but sadly pleasant, emerged in Prince Andrei's soul. During this journey, it was as if he had again thought over his whole life and reached the same old comforting and hopeless conclusion that there was no need for him to start anything, that he had to live out his life without doing evil, without anxiety, and without wishing anything, and without wishing for anything. After returning from the Rostovs, and having been enchanted by Natasha, Andrei passes the oak again. Yes, here in these woods was that oak that I agreed with, thought of Prince Andrei. But where is it, he thought again, looking at the left side of the road and not knowing it himself, not recognizing it. He admired the very oak he was looking for. The old oak, quite transformed, spreading out a canopy of juicy, gnarled fingers, the scars, the old grief and mistrust, nothing could be seen. Juicy green leaves without branches broke through the stiff 100-year-old bark, and it was impossible to believe that this old fellow had produced them. Yes, it's the same oak, thought Prince Andrei, and suddenly a causeless springtime feeling of joy and renewal came over him. All the best moments of his life suddenly recalled themselves to him at the same time. Austerlitz with the lofty sky, and the dead, reproachful face of his wife, and Pierre on the ferry, and a girl excited by the beauty of the night, and that night itself, and the moon. All of it suddenly recalled itself to him. No, life isn't over at the age of 31, Prince Andrei suddenly decided definitively, immutably. It's not enough that I know all that's in me. Everyone else must know it too. Pierre and that girl who wanted to fly into the sky, everyone must know me, so that my life is not only for myself, so that they don't live like that girl independently of my life, but so that it is reflected in everyone and they all live together with me. This return to life ostensibly serves as a great communal moment. Andrei's renewed desire to live occurs through the desire for others, even if there is a sneaky admixture of aesthetic narcissism concealed here. The inclusion of Andrei's wife's death as one of the best moments in Andrei's life can be read as Tolstoy's self-congratulatory celebration of the best moments in his book. For all his faults, Andrei himself is not that callous. It's worth noting, I think, and we will return to this later, that of all Tolstoy's characters, Prince Andrei is not only the one who sounds most like his author. In some respects, he's the character most like Proust's Marcel. His initial attraction to Natasha is occasioned by the intolerable idea of Natasha's ignorance of his existence. For some reason, Prince Andrei suddenly felt pained. The day was so beautiful, the sun was so bright, everything around was so cheerful, and this slender and pretty girl did not know and did not want to know of his existence, and was content and happy with some separate, probably stupid, but cheerful and happy anxiety of her own. What is she so glad of? What is she thinking about? She doesn't care at all about my existence. The desire that a woman take in the idea of his existence is similar to Marcel's preoccupation with the Fisher girls at Baalbek, number 6.
J'aurais voulu que l'idée de moi qui entrerait en cet être, qui s'y accrocherait, n'amenât pas à moi seulement son attention, mais son admiration, son désir, et le forçât à garder mon souvenir jusqu'au jour où je pourrais le retrouver.
Once Natasha does notice Andrei, indeed when she has fallen in love with him, Andrei's reaction is anachronistically reminiscent of Marcel's insistence that Albertine, once she has agreed to a kiss, not kiss him, but issue him a promissory note for a kiss at some point in the future. "I'm so happy," Natasha replied, smiling through her tears, leaned closer to him, thought for a second as if asking herself whether she could, and kissed him. Prince Andrei held her hand, looked into her eyes, and did not find the former love for her in his soul. Suddenly, something suddenly turned over in his soul. The former poetic and mysterious delight of a desire was not there, but there was pity for her woman's and child's weakness. There was fear before her devotion and trust, a heavy but at the same time joyful consciousness of duty that bound him to her forever. Of course, we know it doesn't. Andrei, like Marcel, is constitutionally incapable of being tied down. Now, let's watch what happens to the oak tree Natasha triptych at a climactic moment in Search of Lost Time. But before we get there, let me remind you of how well Proust knew Tolstoy. Proust came late to his appreciation of Russian literature. At the age of 26, he wrote to a friend asking him to please find out for him who had written The Brothers Karamazov, although he had begun reading Anna Karenina earlier in the summer of 1894. But he became enamored of both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. He once said that if he had to choose the most beautiful novel ever written, it would be The Idiot. Tolstoy he considered rather oddly to have been Dostoevsky's student, albeit a talented one. In Dostoevsky, there is, in a concentrated form, still turned in on itself and cramped, a lot of what will blossom in Tolstoy. But he knew Tolstoy well, too. One friend recalls Proust being able to recite bits of the French translation of War and Peace by heart. And he was ready to draw on that knowledge in his analogical poetics, once comparing his friend Robert Dreyfus's description of a little corner of the Parisian sky to Prince Andrei's vision of the sky at Austerlitz. A bit later, in 1910, Proust wrote to Dreyfus, who had noted that Tolstoy would be forever linked to the figure of the simple station master at Ostapovo, where he died, in terms that he wrote to him in terms that show Proust found something poetical in this association. Your article on Tolstoy and the station master pleased me, especially since it was as though Tolstoy had made this junction between two images without comparable importance. It even made me think of the little moujik in the train in Anna Karenina. This moujik is this omen of Anna's doom. Here's another example of our writer's satisfaction when an author's demise is tied to his own poetics. Proust knew Dostoevsky not only for their greatest hits, but also the little ones. Proust dug into War and Peace the way a miner extracts ore, finding marginal characters who interested him and giving them more prominence. To cite just one example, he sent the idiotic diplomat Hippolyte Kouragin to medical school, and allowing him to retain his propensity for seizing on a word spoken by someone else and adding an irrelevant non sequitur, renamed him Dr. Catard. L'empereur renvoie les drapeaux autrichiens, said Bilibine, drapeaux amis et égarés qu'il a trouvés hors de la route. C'est la route de Varsovie, peut-être, Prince Hippolyte said loudly and unexpectedly. Everyone turned to him, not understanding what he meant to say by that. Prince Hippolyte also looked around with merry surprise. Like everyone else, he did not understand the meaning of the words he had spoken. In the course of his diplomatic career, he had noticed more than once that words spoken suddenly like that turned out to be very witty, and just in case he had spoken those words, the first that came to his tongue. Compare Catard, who was looking for a chance of attracting attention, seized on the word blanche, and without lifting his nose from his plate, said blanche, blanche de Castille, then without moving his head, cast his eyes furtively to the right and left with an uncertain smiling look. Morel, a member of a military band who was also a virtuoso violinist, the lover of the Baronne de Charlus, and the son of Marcel's uncle's valet, could be the great-grandson of a soldier of the same name, a French officer's servant in War and Peace, who was also not without a fondness for music and is forced by the exigencies of war to cross-dress. Marcel tells Albertine in a creepy scene that is half foreplay, half lecture on literary composition and Russian literature, I have talked about the same scene recurring in different novels, but within the same novel, scenes and characters can be repeated if the novel is very long. I could easily give you an example from War and Peace. He doesn't, however, because Albertine distracts him. Walter Strauss, in his book on Proust and literature, is irritated by this loss. Albertine has an annoying way of interrupting Marcel's dissertation on novelists whenever the latter strays off the subject of Dostoevsky. In this way, what might have become a fascinating discussion or criticism of Tolstoy falls by the wayside. The Russian critic VICTOIRE takes Albertine's side, however. If Marcel doesn't provide an example, it's because Proust couldn't think of one. Among the humorous details, Proust was lavish in his praise of Tolstoy, noting that Balzac is a mere striver next to him, number 7.
L'œuvre de Balzac est antipathique, grimaçante, pleine de ridicule. L'humanité y est jugée par un homme de lettres désireux de faire un grand livre, dans Tolstoy par un dieu serein. Balzac arrive à donner l'impression du grand. Chez Tolstoy, tout est naturellement plus grand, comme les crottes d'un éléphant à côté d'une chèvre.
Most important, though, is that as the recherche began to expand, readers and correspondents began to compare it to War and Peace. The similarity surfaces as early as 1913, when Proust compares his own notion of memory to that of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, recalling, in particular, a line from Crime and Punishment, and adding, "You must understand that if I cite these great names, it is not in order to put myself on their level." And we hear the comparison again towards the end of Proust's life when a correspondent cautions him about writing too long a book. War and Peace offers itself to the reader as a very long work, but the reader has already been tipped off that it is a masterpiece, which is something that readers of Proust, the readers Proust wants to acquire, don't yet know about the recherche. And so let's look at the scene Nabokov should have examined. The intertextual paving stones he should have rocked back and forth on a little longer. Because when we read, just as when we move through life, we have to stop and be ready to pause as long as it takes until we can pursue the memories back to the book that's their original source. In the final pages of the Recherche's final volume, Marcel is returning to Paris after a long stay at a sanatorium. Depressed about his health and his lack of aptitude for literature, convinced that he will never write anything of value. In the middle of a long paragraph, his railway journey comes to a brief halt.
C'était, je me le rappelle, à un arrêt du train en pleine campagne. Le soleil éclairait jusqu'à la moitié de leur tronc une ligne d'arbres qui suivait la voie de chemin de fer. Arbres, pensais-je, vous n'avez plus rien à me dire. Mon cœur refroidi ne vous entend plus. Je suis pourtant ici en pleine nature. Eh bien, c'est avec froideur, avec ennui, que mes yeux constatent la ligne qui sépare votre front lumineux de votre tronc d'ombre. Si j'ai jamais pu me croire poète, je sais maintenant que je ne le suis pas. Peut-être, dans la nouvelle partie de ma vie, si desséchée, qui s'ouvre, les hommes pourraient-ils m'inspirer ce que ne me dit plus la nature. Mais les années où j'aurais peut-être été capable de la chanter ne reviendront plus. Mais en me donnant cette consolation d'une observation humaine possible, venant prendre la place d'une inspiration impossible, je savais que je cherchais seulement à me donner une consolation et que je savais moi-même sans valeur. Si j'avais vraiment une âme d'artiste, quel plaisir n'éprouverais-je pas devant ce rideau d'arbres éclairé par le soleil couchant, devant ces petites fleurs du talus qui se haussent presque jusqu'au marchepied du wagon, dont je pourrais compter les pétales, et dont je me garderais bien de décrire la couleur, comme feraient tant de bons lettrés. Car peut-on espérer transmettre au lecteur un plaisir qu'on n'a pas ressenti?
There are probably other scenes in world literature in which despairing heroes express their melancholy in arboreal address. If André and Marcel were religious, these scenes would read like initially unanswered prayers to paganistic deities, of the sort with which, as Yves Kosofsky-Sedgwick has reminded us, the Recherche is strangely and explicitly rife. For the moment, the most important aspect of this echo may seem to be its metafictive transposition. The words are spoken not only about the arc of a character's life, but about writing itself. The frozen heart, the cœur refroidi, mentioned here stands not just for romance, but for artistic talent. But it is what happens next that should interest us most. Having returned to Paris, Marcel goes to a party at the house of the Prince de Guermantes, an event at which many of the characters from earlier volumes will be present, and which thus assumes an epilogic cast. There he has a series of involuntary memories, the first one produced by a mysteriously familiar sensation of unsteadiness as he steps on a paving stone, which recalls to him an earlier trip to Venice. The second occurs as he walks into the house, number 9.
Mais, arrivé au premier étage, un maître d'hôtel me demanda d'entrer un instant dans un petit salon bibliothèque attenant au buffet, jusqu'à ce que le morceau qu'on jouait fût achevé. Or, à ce moment même, un second avertissement vint renforcer celui que m'avaient donné les 2 pavés inégaux et m'exhorter à persévérer dans ma tâche. Un domestique, en effet, venait, dans ses efforts infructueux pour ne pas faire de bruit, de cogner une cuillère contre une assiette. Le même genre de félicité que m'avaient donné les dalles inégales m'envahit. Les sensations étaient de grande chaleur encore, mais toutes différentes, mêlées d'une odeur de fumée, apaisée par la fraîche odeur d'un cadre forestier. Et je reconnus que ce qui me paraissait si agréable était la même rangée d'arbres que j'avais trouvée ennuyeuse à observer et à décrire, et devant laquelle, débouchant la canette de bière que j'avais dans le wagon, je venais de croire un instant, dans une sorte d'étourdissement, que je me trouvais, tant le bruit identique de la cuillère contre l'assiette m'avait donné, avant que j'eusse eu le temps de me ressaisir, l'illusion du bruit du marteau d'un employé qui avait arrangé quelque chose à une roue du train pendant que nous étions arrêtés devant ce petit bois. Alors, on eût dit que les signes qui devaient ce jour-là me tirer de mon découragement et me rendre la foi dans les lettres avaient à cœur de se multiplier. Car un maître d'hôtel depuis longtemps au service du prince de Guermantes m'ayant reconnu et m'ayant apporté dans la bibliothèque où j'étais pour m'éviter d'aller au buffet un choix de petits fours, un verre d'orangeade, je m'essuyais la bouche avec la serviette qu'il m'avait donnée. Mais aussitôt, comme le personnage des 1001 nuits, qui sans le savoir accomplissait précisément le rite qui faisait apparaître, visible pour lui seul, un docile génie prêt à le transporter au loin, une nouvelle vision d'azur passa devant mes yeux. Mais il était pur et salin, il se gonfla en mamelles bleuâtres. L'impression fut si forte que le moment que je vivais me sembla être le moment actuel. Plus hébété que le jour où je me demandais si j'allais vraiment être accueillie par la princesse de Guermantes ou si tout n'allait pas s'effondrer, je croyais que le domestique venait d'ouvrir la fenêtre sur la plage et que tout m'invitait à descendre me promener le long de la digue à marée haute. La serviette que j'avais prise pour m'essuyer la bouche avait précisément le genre de raideur et d'empesée de celle avec laquelle j'avais eu tant de peine à me sécher devant la fenêtre, le premier jour de mon arrivée à Balbec. Et maintenant, devant cette bibliothèque de l'hôtel de Guermantes, elle déployait, répartie dans ses pans et dans ses cassures, le plumage d'un océan vert et bleu comme la queue d'un paon. Et je ne jouissais pas que de ces couleurs, mais de tout un instant de ma vie qui les soulevait, qui avait été sans doute aspiration vers elle, dont quelques sentiments de fatigue ou de tristesse m'avaient peut-être empêché de jouir à Balbec, et qui maintenant, débarrassé de ce qu'il y a d'imparfait dans la perception extérieure, pur et désincarné, me gonflait d'allégresse.
I recognized that what I was enjoying so much was the same row of trees that I had found tedious to observe and describe. Philippe Chardin has argued that the great revelation scenes in the Recherche have their roots in Russian literature. These epiphanies related to how one should live one's life, or shouldn't live at all, in Tolstoy, are transformed into how one should live in order to write in Proust. The breakthrough moments come, Chardin writes, not only from moments of involuntary memory, but also from a series of ecstatic contemplations whose models are certainly to be sought in the Russian novel. Let's push Chardin's general insight further and make it more specific and literal, looking less at the forest and more, as it were, at the trees. Proust wasn't only generally taking these epiphanies from a Russian model, but actively rereading, cribbing directly from these models themselves. Thus, it is fitting that the scene of Marcel's sudden understanding of his own task as a writer and of the nature of time occurs in a library, because it is not only the start of the character rereading and writing his own life, but a rereading and rewriting of Tolstoy, who is there not only through that scene with the trees transposed from War and Peace, but also, as I hope you noticed, in that noise of the hammer with which a railwayman has done something to a wheel of the train, a reminiscence of that moujik hammering something iron that haunts Anna Karenina. Both scenes are epiphanies, moments of transcendence for central characters. Note, though, the fundamental difference. Where in War and Peace, the great breakthrough comes through contact, however fleeting, with another human being, Natasha, and promises, perhaps illusorily, a communal future of interrelated beings. In Time Found Again, everything takes place within the self. Marcel does not need to meet or communicate with another being to suddenly blossom as an artist. What is important is to relate past and present moments within the self. There is no need for Marcel to return to that forest. Indeed, if Marcel were to return there, it might be as dead to him as before. Here, beauty and art are born in an artistic overcoming of time that occurs within the self. If an other is present, that other is a book. The clink of the hammer is part of an immersion in Tolstoy that provokes the hero to an epiphany about the nature of art. Aesthetic metamorphosis has occurred not in a perceived object, but in the subject or viewer. And the repetition that haunted Anna, but which provides the pattern that shapes her creator's artistic text, serves in Proust to mark the triumph of both the character and his author. The candle illuminating the book, the image that accompanies the moujik's final appearance in Anna, will for Proust burst into brighter flame because Marcel's epiphany will not only end but begin his book. Epilogue becomes prologue, as will occur, of course, later in The Gift and Pnin. And Tolstoy provides the spark that enables Marcel to make this transition, which is also something of an apotheosis of the self. One might even say that for Proust, like Lolita for Humbert, Tolstoy has been safely solipsized. Thank you. Thank you for reading. You need a lot of press to read Proust. Do we switch places?
Because I have to put my phone on.
No. Well, we go.
Je partage mon écran d'abord. Ouais. Ah non, je peux partager juste ça. Ça marche aussi. Est-ce que je peux passer après en mode diaporama? C'est ça? Comme ça? Oui, c'est ça, ça marche. Thank you so much, Eric, for this very fascinating talk. Actually, I enjoyed reading your quotations so much that I'm thinking about, cutting my talk and reading only the quotations. Maybe that would be better.
That's from the book of thought.
So I will not do that because I've prepared something. So I want to use my energy, and I will give my talk as announced on the topic was Anna Karenina raped, the Russian novel in the age of consent. So I am perfectly aware that some of you might find the title of this talk problematic, ridiculous, or maybe inadequate. If you do, I beg you to address your criticism to my colleague Eric NAIMAN, who happens to be a master of preposterous readings of Russian literature. Of course, as you well know if you have read his writings, preposterous here means... Est-ce qu'on voit bien? Ah oui, on voit très bien. Preposterous here means a resolutely anachronistic reading of literary texts, derived from the common sense observation that we don't spontaneously read in context. We read through the filter of our literary memory and previous knowledge of the books, and this can actually reverse or bend the course of literary chronology, giving us a sense of anticipation or concomitance, which seems a delusion in the objective time of history, but is still very prevalent in our experience as a reader. I quote Proust's famous mention of Dostoevsky. When Proust reads Madame de Sévigné, he finds that Madame de Sévigné has a petit côté Dostoevsky. So it's a typical case of this kind of inversion of literary chronology. But what strikes Proust is that it is still our first impression as readers, and it's what strikes us most in the literary text. As well exemplified by Oulipian traditions or by Pierre Bayard's criticism, this delusional sense of literary chronology is very productive in terms of criticism, since it casts a light not only on the phenomenology of reading, but also on how literary traditions work and interact to produce meaning. Reading preposterously, as in the works of our esteemed colleague, appear here as a prism to produce new interpretations, which can fully coincide with a more philological, positivistic, and objective approach. By evoking the rape of Anna Karenina, my point here is to reuse this creative approach, but in a slightly different way, to repurpose it, as you would say, I guess. In dealing with the notion of consent in Russian novel, I focus on another prism which is often deemed preposterous and which consists in reading past fiction through the filter of our contemporary moral values and social concepts, not through the filter of literary memory of a reader from today, such as in Bayard or NAIMAN. Among these contemporary concepts, consent is actually the most emblematic one. As a pivotal point of a moral revolution, I quote Kwame Anthony Appiah, which highlights female desire and will in sexual interactions, as is now the norm in a supposedly egalitarian and gender-aware society. However, consent is still the object of debate in literary criticism in terms of methodology. Can the critique use the lens of consent to read fiction written at a time when this notion was not so prevalent or even did not exist at all as the important moral and social construct we know today? Do we run the risk of imposing our moral values and hence our contemporary discomforts to texts and authors who will then be considered guilty of ethical failure? A gesture who would be considered reading preposterously in a much more literal way. As we have seen, the post-Oulipian perspective has the advantage of normalizing preposterous reading and enabling the reader not to feel guilty himself. As it is perfectly understandable to sometimes have the uncanny feeling that Nabokov wrote a novel called Dvojnik in 1846, it is okay to feel that some writers fail to be aware of female consent, or, on the contrary, that they display anticipatory awareness on this topic. Here again, the problem is less about moral values per se than about experiences of reading. Since Aristotle, we have lived on the idea that anything could be represented, even foul deeds or dire violence, provided that some profit could be taken from this representation. You can depict horrible murders on the stage of the tragedy if this leads to a catharsis on the viewer, the Poetics famously argues. It means that if moral values evolve, it is perfectly normal that the profit that we extract from fiction evolves as well. and that at times we might have a feeling of discrepancy between what the text has programmed in terms of moral values and what we expect from it as subjects set in a different moral environment. The question is, what should we do with this uncanny feeling? Should we remind ourselves the different contexts in order to bridge the discrepancy as fast as we can? Or should we try the same twist as the post-Tulipian critique in assuming that following this preposterous first impression will actually lead somewhere interesting? I would like to try the twist by raising the question of the rape of Anna Karenina. By focusing on this episode, I would also like to pay homage not only to the French flair of post-Tulipian critique, which has been prolonged excellently by Professor NAIMAN, but also to another tradition embodied by John Sutherland's book, which you can see there, Is Heathcliff a Murderer? Puzzles in 19th Century Fiction. A much more serious version of the literary detective Pierre Bayard, Sutherland has approached 19th century literature through the blanks left by the text, and he has especially raised the question of the moral attitudes of the heroes. The last book of a series which contains Can Jane Eyre Be Happy? Or Who Betrays Elizabeth Bennet? Deals directly with the question, was Henry V a war criminal? Besides, a chapter of the book on Heathcliff, this one, is entitled, Was Tess of the d'Urberville Raped? Which has actually given rise to a whole critical trend trying to figure out what exactly happens in Thomas Hardy's novel and to what extent it will interact with the reader's moral feelings and hence with the novel interpretation. As such, Sutherland's works, though less well-known and far less witty than Bayard, have also been instrumental in showing how productive, in terms of literary criticism, or discomforts, interrogation, or necessary short-sightedness can be. Okay, that's for the methodology, but no, why Tolstoy? When it comes to rape culture in the Russian novel, it might not be the first name to pop up. But actually, when you look at Vronsky and Anna's first sex scene and its reception, both at the time of the publication in February 1975 and in contemporary culture and criticism, there is definitely a blank in the text, quite like those cherished by John Sutherland. And this blank definitely leads to hermeneutic trouble and alternative interpretations of the novel, as in Pierre Bayard's criticism. Why Tolstoy? Because maybe this blank here is not only caused by the lack of structure of this large, loose, baggy monster, not fully mastered even by its creator, but maybe it is a result of a deliberate cultivation of a sense of hermeneutic discomfort, which sets a model for how consent can have a narrative function early on in the history of the Russian novel. So in order to validate readers' feeling more efficiently, I will start by really reading backward from contemporary receptions of this scene to older ones, without showing straight away the text of Tolstoy's novel. Anyway, I think most of you probably remember this very vivid scene. When it comes to rape culture in the 19th century novel, Anna Karenina is more often mentioned than expected, as shown by this example from the net, Rape and Russian Novels. What Anna Karenina really tells us about the Paddy Jackson trial, it's a case of rape in contemporary America. Or this one, 5 literary couples that perpetuate rape culture, and you see Karenina and Vronsky. No, it's Karenin, sorry, but there is another example with Vronsky, but they come first, actually, in this kind of, I don't know, contest of worst couples ever. And in the more traditional criticism, the issue has also been raised, especially by critic Marvin Mudrick, who does mention this passage as a scene of rape of extraordinary, though concealed, violence. So we might feel that such readings are displaced, that they occur because unfortunately there are bad readers of Russian literature, but actually they are part of a longer genealogy which, for entirely different reasons, incriminated Tolstoy for exactly the same scene. So the passage I'm referring to occurs quite early in the novel. It's chapter 10, now chapter 11 in the volume edition, of the second of 8 parts of the novel. And it is the locus of one of Tolstoy's first conflicts with his publisher, Mikhail Katkov, who, as you well know, will refuse to publish the end of Anna Karenina, the ending chapters, because they were felt as not patriotic enough in the context of the Russian-Turkish War of 1877. After reading what Tolstoy has sent him for the second installment of the novel, Katkov accuses the chapter of being false, and Tolstoy tries to defend his chapter. I won't touch anything in the last chapter. Crude realism, as you put it, is my only weapon, since I cannot resort to pathos nor reasoning. And it is one of the passages on which the novel stands. If this is false, then all the rest is false. This letter actually predates publication, which occurs at the end of February, but it does elicit the first questions from readers who had been, until then, enthusiastic about the novel. In a letter to the philosopher Nikolai Strakhov, Tolstoy mentions a conversation he had after the publication of the chapter with one of the Samarin brothers. We could not really identify which one, either Yuri or Piotr. Samarin told me, where there are 2 lines of dots, I guess there were in fact 2 chapters, and that's really a pity they were not there. I answered, it's a pity that all that's missed is filth. If I wrote it 100 times, I wouldn't change anything at that moment. Strakhov mentions his troubled reception in a letter to Tolstoy in a much more diplomatic way. The craving for the novel is still very high. At first, I had thought that the second installment was less successful, but it is really quite the opposite. As far as the weak parts you mention are concerned, no one speaks about it. The progressists, Stasov, Polonsky, and all the others are really quite astonished to see that Anna is so ashamed of herself, and they suppose that is because you're a defender of traditional morality. So you might think that the weak parts refer to the sex scene, but it's not the case. Actually, the weak parts that Tolstoy mentioned in an earlier letter are basically all the scenes going to the final sex scene between Anna and Vronsky, which is in fact the end of the installment. So the installment ends with this scene. Strakhov tries to shift Tolstoy's attention by underlying that this final scene is far more problematic for the reader than everything that was before, and that it might indeed damage the reception of the novel, a fact that Tolstoy is not at all willing to hear. So the reproaches made towards the second installment indeed concentrate on the last scene. We see from this brief survey that they are mutually contradictory. The passage is felt as both obscene, Katkov's expression of crude realism, when there is nothing to see, and which is anticipating Marvin Mudrick's intuition that it might be a rape, but it is also seen as too prude. Samarin says the passage is not explicit enough, while Stasov and Polonsky's accuse Tolstoy of defending traditional morals. Readers also attack the passage both in terms of content and in terms of economy of the novel. The progressive writers, for example, consider that the scene is not consistent with the rest of the action and the message they thought they could grasp from the novel, since it corresponds to an ideological statement of Tolstoy defending traditional morality, which gives the novel a different orientation than they had until now expected. So reading backward from contemporary discomforts actually leads us to a more ancient set of disturbed reader responses. What is clear is what Tolstoy thought would be the climax of the installment was actually a crash test for the novel. It raised questions both from reader reading in the feuilleton form, who do not know the end of the novel, and from nowadays readers who know how the novel ends. So why? What happens in the novel? Why so many questions around this chapter? So in the second installment, you see, towards the end of the installment, chapter 7 to chapter 9, which show us Anna and Vronsky flirting together in a salon. This is one of the parts that Tolstoy deemed weak. To the point, so they flirt, to the point of not noticing the entrance of the husband. So Karenin walks in and they're completely in their conversation, so they don't see him. Then the beginning of chapter 10 shifts to Alexei Alexandrovich, the husband, reflecting on the problematic behavior of his wife in the salon. Then you have 2 lines of dots separating the chapter in 2 parts, and in the volume edition, another chapter will begin there. And after these 2 lines of dots, you can see Alexei Kirillovich, the lover, and Anna in post-coitum despair. She cries her eyes out while he compares himself to a murderer. That which for Vronsky had been almost a whole year the one absorbing desire of his life, replacing all his old desires. That which for Anna had been an impossible, terrible, and even for that reason more entrancing dream of bliss, that desire had been fulfilled. So you don't see it. Anna, Anna, he said with a choking voice. Anna, for pity's sake. But the louder he spoke, the lower she dropped her once proud and gay, now shame-stricken head, and she bowed down and sank from the sofa where she was sitting, down on the floor at his feet. She would have fallen on the carpet if he had not held her. My God, forgive me, sobbing, she said, sobbing, pressing his hand to her bosom. I actually put my God into brackets because in the original version published in the Ruski Vjesnik, you see that you have the 2 lines of dots, and then the chapter continues without another chapter beginning, and you see that the last sentence is Prasti so Tolstoy adds afterwards the my God to make the line more plausible. Anyway, the contrast between the 2 parts of the chapter is really extreme, as well as the contrast with the previous chapter. The scene of flirt is very much reminiscent of the glamorous atmosphere of the Sviatskaya Povest, or Tale of High Society, while in comparison, the passage is contaminated by the vocabulary of guilt and crime. Tolstoy said about Vronsky that he felt what a murderer must feel, so a very strong and shocking vocabulary. We are indeed very far away from the Tale of High Society, in which adultery is basically not a problem as far as it stays hidden. It is the basic, very much common intrigue for this kind of text in the Tale of High Society. So this end of the installment comes as a big surprise for the feuilleton reader, who has seen Anna fighting to escape Vronsky pursuits before being vanquished by love, a typical polyorsetic intrigue, which in the various schemes of romance is never followed by scenes of tears and despairs, except if one of the characters is revealed to be a villain. But in Anna Karenina, as faulty as Vronsky might seem at some point in the novel, he is no villain, nor is Anna. And indeed, the next big scene in the story of their passion is again a scene of perfect love. At the horse race, Anna acknowledges her love to her husband and unfortunately basically to everyone else present attending the event. The atmosphere of crime isn't much more consistent when you know the novel already and you are aware of Anna's miserable end and suicide. if this is a premonition of the doomed and passionate relationship that will lead her to her death, why is she not following this insight that she might get killed in the process of living her passion? Indeed, when the third installment begins in March 1875, it is as if nothing had happened, and Anna's pangs of consciousness will hardly ever repeat in the novel during daytime. They will more take the form of dreams. So chapter 10/11 is an hapax, both in the love story and in the moral tale, depending on which way you read Anna Karenina. It is the only instance of early tension between the lovers, and it is too brief a moment to serve as a true warning for the main character to stop behaving the way she does. It is indeed a scene of strange and displaced violence, which does not fit into either of the expected genres of the novel, giving rise to this perturbed reception and to inquiry. What's in there? What do the two lines of dot conceal? What is the message? Show us more, or at least tell us why we can know. Tell us more so we can know what we are supposed to do with this experience of violence. Remember Aristotle, violence is okay as long as you know what to do with it. Otherwise, you will find that it is obscene, the way that Tolstoy's early reader did. Tolstoy is, of course, not inconsistent here. Not only does the text hold strong autobiographical notes reminiscent to anyone that has read either Tolstoy's or his wife Sophia's diary, where the same atmosphere of crime and murder is present when it comes to their first sexual contact, but the writing of the novel has begun precisely with this sequence. Indeed, from a genetical perspective, it seems that Tolstoy started writing his novel with what is now chapter 7 of the second part, namely the salon scene with the trio, husband, wife, and lover. Here, Tolstoy builds upon a fragment left by Pushkin, "Gosti sježались na daču," which actually ends with a line of dots because you don't know the name of the dacha, and it's a fragment, so you are left to imagine what happens next, quite like in Anna Karenina. And in Pushkin's fragment, the interest of the text is this kind of latency moment when the lovers are distracted to the point of not seeing anything around them. But Tolstoy uses the fragment, but adds his own coda with the vivid realism of the guilt after sex scene. So the two parts, the felicities of courtships and the horrors of sex, horror is the last word of the chapter and the installment, are really made to work together in a strange diptych. In that perspective, it is fully understandable that readers try to figure out what exactly has happened in this scene. Everything being possible, from rape performed on Anna, evoked by the idea of murder, and by Anna's recusation to Vronsky that this has been a moment of happiness or pleasure, or it can be Anna's full agreement to sex, which she later regrets. He feels a murderer, but actually she's the one to ask forgiveness from him in the journal edition of the passage. And this passage, which is "Forgive me," in the journal edition, which will become a more ambiguous "My God, forgive me" in the volume edition. But Tolstoy deprives us of the complete picture, since with these two lines of dots, he seems to draw our attention, even to draw us as reader in the passage with a trap. These two lines of dots, at first, we understand as an expression of Karenin's perplexity and incapacity to resolve the situation. And only afterwards, we understand that they actually dissimulate the sexual intercourse. So Tolstoy actually cultivates this effect of surprise. This leads the critic to focus on the few explicit signs given in the scene, and most prominently on Anna's tears, which are heavily commented upon by Tolstoy contemporary. But here again, Tolstoy plays with our expectation as reader. It is fully normal for a woman in 19th century to shed tears in the vicinity of sex. In the 19th century literature and society, it is even expected from a woman of good and moral conduct to show that she is not willing to surrender. But this fully approved script of sexuality is perturbated here by a bad timing. Anna should be crying before, not after sex. Or if she cries after sex, it means that she should be crying in front of her legal partner, the other Alexei. After all, the novel begins with a scene of tears after sex, but these tears are Stivas Oblonsky's tears in front of his wife, who has just found out that he's been cheating on her with a French governess. Dolly's comment on these tears, "Your tears are just water, vaše sljoze voda," underlines their extremely topical nature, and hence that we are in a context of really very firm set of expectations from the reader. Hence, Anna's tears borrow from a lot of different scripts, but they are displaced in terms of timing or in terms of addressee. The tears signal that, according to social and literary expectations, Anna should be perfectly happy, but she's crying in a much carnivalesque and slightly Dostoevskian way, actually. Here again, the only clue the reader can have is that something, in fact, much more serious than sex has happened, and that it can explain maybe those tears. The literary misplaced nature of those tears is also more sensitive in the context of the history of emotions in Imperial Russia, which is now a well-known academic field. Alexandra Oberländer, for example, notes that in the second half of the 19th century, the question of tears became essential in trials for sexual offenses. Studying the case of Elizaveta Cheremnova, who committed suicide in 1985 after being raped, Oberländer highlights the fact that crying became the central issue in judicial debates. They were what made it possible to determine that rape had indeed taken place. And according to the researcher, it marks the transition from a paradigm of honor, where the defilement corresponds only to the victim's social status, which tends to minimize accusation of rape pronounced by ordinary women. And we go to a paradigm of subjectivity, which made it possible for each woman to prove rape, independently of their social status, in proportion of the shame they felt. Although the case that Oberländer studied dates from 1885, the punishment code established this increased attention to shame and signs of shames as early as 1845, which tended to blur the ordinary signs and establish postcoital crying as evidence that a rape has been committed. So tears are really telling something, the epoch suggests. But are they in Anna Karenina, since they seem quite quickly swallowed and forgotten by the main character? Are Anna's tears to be interpreted as a very important signal of an atmosphere of rape, or as a non-signal, an empty signifier, borrowed from various scripts and background, but without any possibility of interpreting them in a definite way? The scene is very much reminiscent of a passage from War and Peace, where Pierre witnesses his father lying on his deathbed and staring at him in a very intense way. The narrator remarks that this intense gaze can either signify too much, the remorse of leaving a child without any inheritance, for example, or signify nothing at all. So it's either too much, either nothing. In this scene, the sex scene between Anna and Vronsky, we are caught between exactly these two extremes. We cannot but focus on Anna's tears and imagine that maybe there is a very serious cause for them. And on the same time, we cannot avoid the conclusion that they might not be significant in the end. Another possible interpretation, by the way, is that there might very well be a pure reflex motion. It is well known that Anna Karenina was begun at the very time of the end of the controversy on the links between psychology and physiology, which was begun by Ivan Sechenov's book about the brain's reflexes. And actually, when Tolstoy starts to write Anna Karenina, Sechenov has just issued a kind of last book about this topic, which ends completely the controversy. And Tolstoy alludes to this book in Anna Karenina because after he is caught with the French governess, Stiva Oblonsky says, "I'm guilty, but I'm not guilty because it's not me. My sexual behavior depends only on my brain reflexes." So you can see that many patterns of interpretation here are possible. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them result in showing that these tears mean nothing special. But Tolstoy tells us that this scene is where the entire novel stands. You remember that letter to Katkov. So does it stand on nothing, like Madame Bovary, un roman sur rien, another story of adultery and unrepentant wife? Or maybe the inexistence of the scene and the potential nothingness of Anna's tears, which are so difficult to bear, that they usually elicit interpretations that something so horrible has happened that it cannot be shown or even represented. Maybe all these things tell us something. It draws our attention to something, to the scene. Since Dostoevsky has already been mentioned here, I would like to quote from his famous essay, Anna Karenina as a Fact of Special Importance, in which Dostoevsky produces a comparative analysis of Tolstoy's novels on the background of European fictions of naturalism. The writer points out that, in general, the European novels present a character who is caught up in the corruption of society of his time, and who ends up yielding to that corruption and sinking away in a more or less violent form. For Dostoevsky, the European novel offers two models of interpretation for such downfalls of character. Either there is an acquiescence to the character's brutal downfall, which guarantees respect for the normal order of society. The character is dead or maimed or anything, but it means that the order of society is protected. Or, second option, it might be that the novel promotes a revision of the character's actual responsibility, which is diluted in explanations linked to the environment, the physiology, the brain's reflexes, etc., etc. You know that it's a very common paradigm from naturalism to say that science can explain the behavior of the characters. With its opening statement, "Vengeance and retribution are mine," for Dostoevsky, Tolstoy's novel would actually open up another path to deal with the character's downfalls. The novel would show the individual and spiritual origin of sin and misfortune, but it would delegate judgment to God and not to man, who are themselves steeped in sin. So the novel for Tolstoy is not a validation of society, and it's not an excuse for its inhabitants. From Dostoevsky's point of view, showing the filth and insisting on Anna's shame in this scene, he does not refer to this scene at all, but it's obviously part of his reading grid. So showing the filth and insisting on the shame is very important because it allows Tolstoy to emphasize that the novel is not only a network of human determination. It makes explicit that there is a dialogue between the individual and his conscience, which differentiates the Russian novel from the European one. So the role of the Russian novel, according to Dostoevsky, is to create a destabilizing movement that makes it possible to go beyond deterministic, mechanistic interpretations and remind us of the spiritual dimension of the human being through this ancient guilt that comes back in an untimely manner. This is why Tolstoy needs the tear in a Dostoevskian reading grid. Those misplaced, inconvenient, ambivalent signs of distress, they help him reshape the idea that everything happens for a reason, and that it can be controlled from the outside, from a rational point of view. A fact that is always dismissed in Tolstoy's novel in favor of the continuity of life, which explains why some things occur and some do not. A funny example that you might remember from Anna Karenina is the missed proposal of Koznichev, Levin's half-brother, who walks in a forest. He's strolling in a forest with a girl he wants to marry. He's determined to make a proposal, but then the girl asks the difference between two kinds of mushrooms. So Koznichev starts thinking about it, and he forgets about the proposal. He cannot do it, and it will never happen. There will never be a proposal uttered between these two characters. So it shows that for Tolstoy, what should happen is not always happening because you have this sense of continuity of action. So by its incongruity, the guilt after sex scene is pivotal in the novel because it enables the writers to abolish ordinary causal privileges and reshape novelistic motivation entirely. By having Anna cry, Tolstoy invites us to think about why she should not be crying, according to us, and to realize how such expectations actually produce a very dry vision of life and of the novel. Tolstoy's novel thus wishes to abolish this form of causal privileges that leads us to think that things have to be for a reason, which seems to explain the fact, but is nothing more than a reconstruction which stands very far away from the real flow of life. This is, of course, reminiscent of the very well-known philosophy of history by Tolstoy, which aims to prevent historical events from being understood from above through the strategic actions of a few great men, usually put forward in a posterior reconstruct, when, for Tolstoy, the course of history is a sedimentation of multiple individual actions caught up in autonomous flows of life. So the gruesome atmosphere of the sex scene in Anna Karenina may seem unexpected and obscene, but in this very way, it reveals the existence of a self-evident vital flow, which our retrospective gaze would naturally obscure in favor of a deterministic explanation. And in the same way that War and Peace abolishes the causal privilege of the great man in the flux of history, Anna Karenina does abolish in this passage the causal privilege of men, and especially partners, in the apparition of tears and shame and helplessness. As I said, it is commonly understood that Anna should be crying, indeed, because she's married to Alexei Alexandrovich, or that she should not be crying because she's just had sex with Alexei Kirillovich. So the problem is she's crying in front of the wrong Alexei. So maybe it doesn't matter who you're crying to, because in the novel, Anna is not the one to experience shame in her sex life, and it is usually totally independent of the nature or even the existence of the male partner. All the other women in the novel experience distress in love and sex, be they married, unmarried, adulterous, or faithful. There is, of course, a striking parallel between Anna's shame and Dolly's shame, even though they are placed at opposite ends of the adulterous scheme. And Dolly does remember her own wedding night with Stiva as a night of tears. But I have another case, an even more striking parallel with Kitty, whose wedding night is gruesome as well, which is not surprising for Tolstoy, of course, who tends to be a bit pessimistic about gender intercourse in general. But there is also another case which is very striking concerning Kitty, because as you well know, at the beginning of the novel, Kitty hopes for a proposal from Vronsky at the ball, a proposal which will never come, as we know. After the ball scene, we lose sight of Kitty. But when the novel gets back to her, we are very surprised to find a girl ridden with guilt and shame, feeling that the young lady finds well-deserved because she has made herself available in a context which was, in the end, not a marital one. So she believes she has indeed something to reproach to herself. She is so ill with shame that she has to go abroad to a sanatorium to get treatment, which results in nothing but more shame for her. She has done absolutely nothing wrong on the social or moral plan, but shame is her condition as a woman. It's her constant companion, and it will be there during her wedding night with Levin, of course. Tolstoy thus presents us, to use the title of a book coordinated by F. Kosowski-Sedgwick, with Anna's shame and her sisters. Drawing the reader's attention to Anna Karenina's guilt also prepares the readers to see that shame and tears are everywhere as soon as sex is mentioned in the novel, whether legitimate or not. In fact, all the tears are misplaced in the fiction, since they affect unhappily married woman, Dolly, happily married woman, Kitty, and both happily and unhappily adulterous women, like Anna. Actually, even the hedonistic Stiva feels it and mentions the embarrassments of sex. When he's caught upon committing the adultery, he says, his comment is ужасно тривиально, horribly trivial. So we are invited to change our way of looking at things, to move away from explanations that at first seem obvious. She cries because she's married. She should not cry because she has a handsome lover, but which in fact turn out to be situated and evil, male-centric explanations. Chapter 10 begins with a strong focus on the two Alexeys, as I said, first with the interrogation of the husband, and then with the terror of the lover, witnessing Anna's despair. But the chapter moves away from the two men by giving more and more agency and importance to Anna, precisely through her tears and the unfathomlessness of her tears. By putting Anna's tears in a more general context of the tragic nature of sex, Tolstoy runs the risk of returning to a kind of determination, since this behavior is shared by almost all women, and sometimes even men, in the novel. But for Tolstoy, this line of determination is not deterministic, because it refers to the rejection, for spiritual reasons, of what underpins the legitimacy of sex on a physical and social level. Anna's tears are the natural reaction of a soul that cannot be silenced, that is seeking to escape what is imposed on her, the bondage of the body to social and moral codes of its time. We are reminded here of Dostoevsky, who saw the novel as a way out of the pressure of the environment, typical of the European novel of the second half of the 19th century in the West. So in that respect, this scene is indeed pivotal, as Tolstoy announced, because it is one of the first moments in the novel when there is a bridge in the gap between the epigraph and the first sentence of the novel, between fatality, vengeance and retribution are mine, and idiosyncrasy, about the two kinds of families. For Anna, her shame activates a set of spiritual values that are usually cancelled in our mundane experience. And it is a reminder of this vengeance and retribution, our mind, of the concealed spiritual nature of human experience. But those tears also delineate a private territory for the character in which nobody can really enter, in which her tears really belong to her. Actually, in this scene, Anna is just being what the incipit announced. She's unhappy in her very own way. Nieszczęśliwa po-swojemu. Po-swojemu meaning here, of course, in an entirely unexpected and personal form, but also through her own private motivations that no one among the reader can really share. It's following her own path, po-swojemu. The tears of Anna establish her without question as the central or bicentral protagonist of the novel, which was not obvious for the readers of the time of Tolstoy. It is striking that the criticism of the first installment focuses almost exclusively on the character of Stiva as representative of the unhappy families, where Anna embodied the happy ones. After this scene, it is clear that the groups are not so clearly separated as they seemed, and that Anna bifurcates to burst through her tears into the second one, that of the unhappy families. It shows what maxims are made for in the Tolstoyan world. The typologies they establish always stay valid, but the people in the categories they defined have a tendency to move around unexpectedly. A move completely at odds with the quite descending model of naturalism, for example. Here again, Stiva is a good example because at the beginning of the novel, he talks with Levin and he says that there are two groups of women for him, the normal and the fallen, and that he cannot stand the second group. He would never have any interaction with the second group, the group of the fallen woman. And there is a strong irony in this scene because actually the chapter begins with the first mention of the entire novel of the name of Vronsky, a character who will obviously wreak havoc in Stiva's nice and neat typology of good women and bad women. So writing of sex as rape and murder is indeed very consistent with Tolstoy's vision of gender relationship, and it's no surprise for the reader of the extended oeuvre, including the Kreutzer Sonata. But it was obviously more of a surprise for the readers of 1875, as it might still be for some readers today. But what I've tried to demonstrate is that the scene is not only an early example of Tolstoy's pessimism about sex. It's also a way of reshaping the novelistic motivation in the context of a love/sex/rape scene that is loaded with expectations from the reader, especially when the novelist asks him or her to fill the missing details of the scene. Describing sex as such a terrifying moment gives her agency to the character of Anna. She has just yielded to Vronsky, yet something resists in her all the same, which is actually very consonant with the contemporary definition of consent as a mixture of passivity and agency. It allows us to get back to the question we raised at the beginning of this talk. Is there rape in Anna Karenina? Does the question have any meaning? I didn't try to demonstrate that you have to get back to the context to address difficulties that you find as a contemporary reader. Actually, my move towards a 19th century reception of this scene was meant to show that you experience difficulties in a text because they are actually there, and that they have puzzled the reader for a very, very long time, the historical reception shows. So maybe it's time to validate our feelings as reader, as the ethical turn of literary studies supposes. It also allows us to stop assuming that classical writers are usually moral monsters or just living in an entirely different moral environment as we do, and that we should have to excuse them in advance for the way they relate to contemporary issue. Maybe you can accept the moral accusations made toward Tolstoy and use them to read the text better. reading rape in Anna Karenina actually makes the heroine a true heroine. It points to this very important moment of bifurcation on which the novel indeed stands. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. I have a few comments, but we will get to them later on. But I think it's pretty obvious that you both talked about the reader's experience, actually, and the authors as readers that read each other's work, and how the readers' readers are invited to come into the text and transform its meaning. So it was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. How would you like to proceed? Maybe Victoire, you first comment on Eric's work, and then we get back to Victoire's talk, and then we'll leave the floor open for the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a few comments, and I have one comment which concerns the longest version of your talk, so maybe we can talk about it later, I don't know, because it does not concern the public, but still, I appreciated, of course, a lot what you said, and I have a series of short comments about Andrei remembering the face of his wife, of his dead wife, as the best moment of his life. One of it's not the only one, but the other one is Austerlitz, so it's also a scene of violence. It's a bit violent. And I was thinking that maybe another way of reading backwards Tolstoy with Proust would be also to read Andrei as a kind of a sadistic lover, a kind of, like, we always interpret in the text the fact that he does not marry Natasha straight ahead, that he allows time to pass as a command from his father, but maybe it's just this kind of Proustian attitude, of trying to raise up embarrassments so horrible things happen. So that was my first comment. And I had also another feeling about a symmetry in your paper is about age, because as you mentioned about the oak tree, it's a bit counterintuitive, especially for students, that this guy is just 31 and he sees a dead oak and he says, oh, it's just like me, my life is over. And it also echoes an earlier comment that I love from a conversation between Pierre and Andrei. And Andrei just turned 28 and he says to Pierre, oh, never marry. Trust me, I have a long experience, just never marry. It's a trap, it's a complete trap. And he's 28, so. It's really funny. And I think it's just the opposite of, this is insistent of age, of having this character with, like, aged too quickly for his physical age, is really quite the opposite, the symmetrical opposite of the narrator at the end of the Recherche, who actually, is remembering things past, and it's like he's reliving them and he's looking forward to his past to relive some kind. So I do believe that there might be also kind of shared obsession with aging too quickly or something in the two characters. My other remark would be about the very funny part you mentioned when Albertine actually does not want to talk about Tolstoy. She said, oh, no, okay with Dostoevsky. She always asks about Dostoevsky, but she's not interested at all in Tolstoy. And it reminds me of the contemporary reception, because Proust is more conservative, so he likes both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but at exactly the same time, you have some author who were also Tolstoyevskians at the beginning, who finally choose Dostoevsky, like Gide. Gide says, oh, I love Tolstoy, I love Dostoevsky, but in the end it's only Dostoevsky. So I wonder whether it's a way of alluding to this context to show that Albertine is not the same generation than the narrator, that for her Tolstoy it's already old references, that it doesn't matter anymore. And I would also have a comment about the moral element in Nabokov, but we can discuss that later, maybe.
Okay, great. Should I respond just quickly to a couple of
yeah,
things?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. The first was Andre as sadist.
Yeah.
Right. So there was this kind of humorous musical, Andre, Natasha and Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, that they kind of turned into a cabaret, and they had, so it's just that episode of Anatole and Andre going away and Natasha being, kidnapped. They had the same actor playing Andre and his father, which I think was a very effective move, right? Because you see that, this is, he doesn't have to obey his father, right? And there's a way of kind of putting this off, the way that, Marcel may not really want Albertine, right? The thing about age, it's a number of things there. When you teach these novels, as you get older, you become older than the characters who seemed so old to you before, right? So, Pulcheria Alexandrovna in Crime and Punishment is just 43, right? And so you get past that and you think, oh my God, right? So time works, in an interesting way in the novels themselves. We can never, just Natasha's age fluctuates wildly. Lisa's pregnancy, as a number of people, Andre Zorin most prominently have pointed out, lasts for 16 months.
Like elephants.
Right, like elephants. So time in these novels, right, is very odd. And Nabokov said, well, that's a virtue, right, in a way that they control time. But they can also just be making mistakes. I think it's I love the idea of Albertine as the Dostoevsky fan. And as Proust, right, by having her cut him off, basically is establishing a sort of moral equivalent, because the great thing about the research, this is the first time I read it, I was, like 20 or so, and I totally believed in everything Marcel thought, right? Just totally, this is the point of view. And then the more you read it, the more you come around to seeing Marcel's sadistic side, and you begin wondering whether the reader's sensibility is supposed to be with Albertine or not, although at times she's very detestable, right, for the narrator at least. So I like this idea of this being a Tolstoy or Dostoevsky question in their relationship. Really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Should I stay here or move? I can stay here, okay. Victoire's paper was extremely interesting and raises all sorts of questions. And actually reading your work on Tolstoy and whether it's necessary to burn Pushkin, I kind of feel like I found a kindred spirit, which is always very nice. So I have, in the spirit of the French lycée essay, I have 3 points to make. First, if we step back for a moment, what does it mean for a character to be raped? We can talk about rape within the diegesis, right? Treating the character as though she were a real person and analyzing whether she consented or not. Or we can consider rape as a metafictional category. Characters don't have bodies, but the illusion of their corporeality is produced through the intercourse of author and reader. In that sense, readers are always complicit in a character's rape. Imagine me, I shall not exist if you do not imagine me. That's Nabokov bearing the device, or the vice of the device, as Humbert Humbert prepares to rape Dolores Hayes. Can a character consent? Every incarnation of a character within a text is potentially an act of violence against a character's will. And this violence is analogizable to rape. 2 novels written almost simultaneously by the same author, not surprisingly Nabokov, make this clear. If Lolita tells of the violation of a character's body, Pnin is predicated on the forced penetration of a character's mind. When Pnin's narrator turns his attention to him, Pnin feels porous and pregnable. This sort of intrusive mental penetration is perhaps the ultimate violation of Anna Karenina. Nabokov saw Tolstoy's depiction of Anna's stream of consciousness as she walks to her death as an important formal innovation that predated Joyce. Anna's mental vivisection is so terrible that she makes the understandable decision to do all she can to escape. Vam vyiti ugodna? Would you like to get out? The conductor asks Anna just a page before she throws herself in front of a train. Yes, she would. After she tells a coachman that he can go home, and just before she kills herself, we read, «Нет, я не дам тебе мучить себя», подумала она, обращаясь с угрозой ни к нему, ни к самой себе, а к тому, кто заставлял ее мучиться, и пошла по платформе мимо станции. «No, I won't let you torment me», she thought, addressing herself not to him, not to herself, but to the one who made her suffer. Who is this one, Vronsky or Tolstoy? Molly Bloom comes off better. Oh, Jamesy, let me out of this poo, she pleads in the final chapter of Ulysses, a more benign universe than the one in which Tolstoy has placed Anna. Anna does not consent to be a passenger in Tolstoy's vehicle, so she resists as best she can. Second, I am struck by Victoire's suggestion that we replace, as a lovely phrase, contextual with contextual reading. This struck a chord with me as I've been thinking a lot about what I've been calling adversarial reading, and Bayard has a similar notion, interventionist criticism, which he explores in his book Aurais-je sauvé Geneviève d'Ixmer. Indeed, Anna Karenina provokes readerly resistance like no novel I've taught, partly because of the way Tolstoy composed Anna Karenina, interlarding newly written episodes within ones he had written a long time ago, something Mikhail Dolbilov shows brilliantly in his recent book, Жизнь творимого романа. Readers often find themselves resisting the omniscient assertions of the narrator as they try to pursue the logic of a version or conception of Anna that appeals to them in the face of a conflicting earlier or later one. What and how is the reader allowed to resist? If we consider the narrator himself as a heterodiegetic character, then we might be able to push against his characterizations of the character's actions, if not against the diegetic reality of those actions themselves. Yielding to this temptation, in the undergraduate seminar I teach on Anna Karenina, I ask the students to try rewriting individual chapters of the novel. They are not allowed to change the character's actions or their words, but they can change anything else. The way I've framed this question may suggest to some of you the domain of fan fiction. And in fact, I think we can get our students to read closely by exploring with them the ways in which literary criticism, even literary scholarship, can border on fan fiction, a genre with which many of our students are familiar. In his now classic article on this genre, Henry Jenkins frames the debate in terms similar to the ones I've just used. He writes, "The ideology of fandom involves both a commitment to some degree of conformity to the original program materials, as well as a perceived right to evaluate the legitimacy of any use of those materials, either by textual producers or by textual consumers." Concerning the television show Star Trek, which has generated an immense amount of fan fiction, Jenkins writes, "The fans perceive themselves as rescuing the show from its producers, who have manhandled the characters and then allowed it to die. Rather than rewriting the series' content, the fans claim to be keeping Star Trek alive in the face of network indifference and studio incompetence, of remaining true to the text that first captured their interest some 20 years before. According to one fan, this relationship came into being because the fan writers loved the characters and cared about the ideas that are Star Trek, and they refused to let it fade into oblivion." As Jenkins describes it, fan fiction is an area of incessant creativity and constant policing. Having Spock and Kirk, or Vronsky and Anna, do something they would never do in the original text constitutes a form of what some fans have called character rape. or characterization rape, the worst form of gross infidelity. I think many readers of Anna Karenina perceive something similar happening throughout the novel, as Tolstoy fails to remain true to what they regard as his initial conception of the characters, but which actually was a secondary or tertiary conception that came to dominate the opening part of the novel. For many readers, the postcoital scene implicitly strikes them as character rape, a term that serves here in a double sense. Anna seems to some readers to have been raped in the diegesis only because she has been raped as a character, forced to act and think in an unnatural way that departs from her essence as these readers understand it. Subsequently, Anna's tears are, as Victoire so nicely puts it, quickly swallowed and forgotten, because she and her fans, like many survivors of sexual violence, are able to repress her and their aesthetic trauma, to pretend for a while that it never happened, until Tolstoy rapes her characterization once again. Finally, third, Anna's tears. Victoire compellingly portrays them as evidence of Anna's body's attempt to escape the social and moral codes of her time. As Victoire notes, tears can be a sentimental convention, but they can also serve as a touch of the real, as evidence of authenticity. Authenticity of feeling, even authenticity of existence for a fictional character. In this sense, they function like semen in an adult film. And indeed, the link of semen to tears goes back to French erotic verse and is reprised, as Oleg Proskorin has shown, by Pushkin. So tears have an expected poetic place in the postcoital setting. We, the enlightened readers of today, understand that women should have as much right to display the proof of their sexual experience as men. But when we read the scene closely, we might reach the conclusion that Anna, and here I want to play devil's advocate for a moment, we might reach the conclusion that Anna does not shed any tears. The term plakat is not applied to her. She is described as splichivaya, sobbing, which is more a phenomenon of the breath than the eyes. Dahl defines it as, defines splichivat as ridat kakvi zadichayas, plakat без рыданий, ни голосом, ни прерывая дыхание икотой. On the other hand, virtually all dictionaries define plakat as prelivat slyozy, to shed tears. So here Anna, perhaps technically, does not cry. And in this context, two interesting things emerge. First, Anna exhibits a hostility towards language and an inability to express herself in words. When Vronsky refers to their happiness, she rebukes him, as we've seen. For God's sakes, not a word more, not a word more, she says. She quickly stood up and moved away from him. Not a word more, she repeated. And with an expression of despair on her face, which he found strange, she left him. But she felt at that moment she could not put into words her feeling of shame and horror. And she did not want to speak of it to trivialize this feeling with imprecise words. But later, too, the next day and the day after that, she not only found no words in which she could express all the complexity of these feelings, but was unable even to find thoughts in which she could reflect with herself all that was in her soul. She kept telling herself, no, I can't think about it now when I'm more calm, but this calm for reflection never came. Each time the thought occurred to her of what she had done, of what would become of her and what she ought to do, horror came over her and she drove these thoughts away. Later, she kept saying, when I'm more calm. So who is speaking here? On one hand, she's ventriloquizing Tolstoy, who also, as we have seen, couldn't find the words, shedding suspension points instead of tears. In this sense, those suspension points, we might say, are his wordless sobs. In this sense, the passage is intensely metapoetic. Dolbilov has pointed out that the introductory sentence to this chapter, that which Vronsky had desired for more than a year, refers not to the diegesis. Vronsky has desired Anna for only a few months, but to the time that Tolstoy had been working on the novel. In other words, in this chapter, Tolstoy has Anna and Vronsky join him in thinking not so much, or at least not only about sex, as about writing, about the writing of the book Anna and Vronsky are in. But to return to Anna's point of view, something different emerges when we listen to the passage that I've just read. We can hear the tears, the slyozy, trying but failing to get out. ради Бога, ни слова больше. Она быстро встала и отстранилась от него. Ни слова больше, повторила она, и со странным для него выражением холодного отчаяния на лице она рассталась с ним. Она чувствовала, что в эту минуту не могла выразить словами того чувства стыда, радости и ужаса перед этим вступлением в новую жизнь и не хотела говорить об этом, опошлив это чувство неточными словами. Но и после, ни на другой, ни на третий день, она не только не нашла слов, которыми бы она могла выразить всю сложность этих чувств, но не находила и мыслей, которыми бы она сама с собой могла обдумать все, что было в ее душе. Она говорила себе: нет, теперь я не могу об этом думать после, когда я буду спокойнее. Но это спокойствие для мыслей никогда не наступало. Каждый раз, как являлась ей мысль о том, что она сделала, и что с ней будет, и что она должна сделать, на нее находил ужас, и она отгоняла от себя эти мысли. После, говорила она, когда я буду спокойнее. This phonetic combination, sl, the start of tears, the start of слезы, which has only appeared once in the chapter so far, sounds 15 times in this short section. Anna can't express the сложность, the complexity of her feelings, but though she tries hard, she also cannot express, to coin a word, the слезность, the tearfulness of her thoughts either, try as she might. In the course of the novel, Anna does cry, mostly when Vronsky falls from Frou-Frou and when she visits Seryoja, but she isn't allowed to cry here. And that raises the question of a phrase Tolstoy uses several times in the book, «хотелось плакать». This seemingly trivial expression, literally meaning she felt the desire to cry, bespeaks a link between longing and sadness. But it also might suggest that characters themselves, and this goes back to Victoire's point, understand that tears help them to resist, or even, like Pinocchio, that tears help them feel as though they are real. However, that desire falls short at critical moments. At the end of part 7, when Anna has parted with Dolly and left for the train station, Dolly says to Kitty, «Когда я ее провожала в передней, мне показалось, что она хочет плакать». That, by the way, is the only time in the book where the desire to cry is grammatically active. Not «ей хочется плакать», but «она хочет плакать». Anna wants to cry, but she can't. The only character who gets to cry in the chapter detailing the aftermath of Anna's first sexual intercourse with Vronsky is Karenin, in Anna's erotic nightmare about having two husbands who are making love to her at once. She dreamed that they were both her husbands, that they both lavished their caresses on her. Alexei Alexandrovich wept, kissing her hands and saying, "It's so good now." Oba rastachali ей свои ласки, they're literally squandering their love. We are back here in the traditional erotic scenario. When everything is consummated, only male desire has been satisfied. In the consummation of the sexual act, men get to cry. Anna tries to cry. She wants to cry, but perhaps she can't. And here again, Joyce was so much nicer to Molly.
Thank you so much for those fascinating remarks. I would like to give a bit of a context for the French academia about this question of rape, which has become very prevalent. And I understand this is about your first remark, that it might sound a bit weird in the country of structuralism to ask whether a character was raped or not. I fully understand. And actually, it's been a question that came back to the foreground some years ago, I would say maybe 7 years ago, because there was a big academic polemic in the context of agrégation. Well, the French minister asked the student willing to pass this concourse for agrégation to study a corpus of French poetry from the 18th century, from André Chénier. And in one of the early poem of André Chénier, there is actually an imitation of Theocritus and a scene of courtship and forced consent on bergère. And the students just didn't want to have that at the agrégation, so they protested. And they first came to their professor of 18th century literature at the University of Paris 3, which was a very, very famous professor. And they were mostly female, came to him and said, how should we read that text? Because there is a rape, so if we have to explain that in front of a jury, I mean, it's weird. And the professor answered, there is no rape, it's a text. If you become a good reader when you stop thinking that there is rape in a text. And this is so typical of the French literary thought in general. If you believe that all of this exists, you're just Emma Bovary. So just go home and you won't have the concourse anyway. But actually, the students resisted, and they tried to reconfigure the academic field by saying that, yes, but you know, as readers, we see things that literary critics don't see. So if we feel that there is something in the text, maybe we should still raise the question. And my point, of course, is not to defend the idea that Anna Karenina has been raped, but if the reader sees things, and it's even more fascinating if the tears are not actually shed, but on the point of being shed, if the readers see them and feel them, it's also there because Tolstoy wants them to think about it, to say, oh, okay, we have something very important here, but I'm not going to show you the scene, and I'm going to leave you only with your doubts. So maybe without returning to this question, was there a rape, there is still a way of like having a conciliation between these two trends, saying that anyway, as a modern reader, you ask yourself the question. It's not unnatural, and it was not unnatural at the time of Tolstoy either, even if the question is a bit displaced. But still, it gives you like a point of view, a kind of panorama towards the text, because definitely, if nothing is shown, you have to find what it is. It's like the black eyeglasses in Barthes' Fragment d'un discours amoureux. It's there. It's not there, so it's there. So you have to try to see beyond. So definitely, I don't think that there are totally antagonistic way of looking at literature. And obviously, it's the way our students read. So maybe it's a good strategy to try to embrace also their point of view and showing that it's not that simple and that we should not read a text because you have the feeling that it's dealing with rape, but that maybe the writer is himself working with your expectations and asking you to see beyond that first impression and to try to use scandal or provocative, or I don't know. I mean, it's a gaudy scene. There is something gaudy about this scene. So it's the perfect moment to grasp the reader's attention and to pass on something very meaningful. So I don't think they're kind of opposite, but I loved your idea about characters' rape. I didn't know about it. I didn't know that people writing fan fiction would say that. Actually, I had the opposite feeling because I've read a book by an American essayist, Claire Dederer, which is called Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. And she's actually raising the question of all these moral issues about literature from the point of view of the reader. And she says that, for example, in her family, they had this kind of drama when J.K. Rowling was accused of being transphobic. Because her children had loved and learned by heart all the books by her. And they had bought Harry Potter t-shirts, they had seen the movies, they had all kind of goodies about Harry Potter. So they were really shocked that the writer was not what they expected. So they had, appropriated the fiction so much that they thought it belonged to the real authors of fan fiction and not to the author. The author was not faithful to the text. So I'm happy to see that it can also be quite the opposite, and that readers of fan fiction have this kind of feeling that sometimes, the author is forcing the character inside the original text, not because he says transgender people are not allowed in public, in women's toilets, for example, or things like that. So that was very interesting. I would definitely check that. As for tears, you are perfectly right. The term is not pronounced, and actually, the one who sheds the most tears in the fiction is Stiva. Definitely, it's totally true. But the critics of the time, we don't have a lot of real reader response, unfortunately. But the critics of the times, they all talk about Anna Karenina's tears. So it's very interesting that they are not there at the same time. They are seeing things that are not so prevalent in the text, and who also raise the question of authenticity of the character. I understand this is not a psychological comment about Anna, but it goes, it falls back to this whole determination of the character as someone who looks natural but was not so natural. You know, it's like when she goes to the ball with Vronsky, she has this very nice curled black hair on her white neck, but the novel says that she did that on design. It's like a kind of negligé outfit. It's made to seduce people. It's not just her natural beauty. So this could be this kind of ей хочется плакать, ей хотелось плакать. It could also be this kind of, she's trying to force her feeling to seem authentical when she's not always authentical. So that could definitely fall in line with this kind of comments. But I adored what you say about this poetic dimension, that you have the feelings that sliozy are there, but they are not in the text. It's always kind of, Tolstoy tries to convey this feeling, but it's not really present. It's definitely very interesting, and I love the association between semen and tears. I did not thought about that. I didn't thought the passage was as gaudy as that, but no, I'm fully convinced. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can I just interject? You just said that readers of the time usually spoke of Anna as constantly tearing up, as constantly crying, yes? While she isn't in the novel. Isn't it also a proof of a male-centric gaze on her, or male gaze on her, that since she's a woman, she should be always crying, so that means every time we speak of Anna, even though she isn't crying in the novel, we think of her as, oh, she's the woman, so she always cries. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, like it would be a forced interpretation from the critics.
Yes.
Well, I'm not sure that tears are completely absent, because she's still sobbing. So, you know, there is still something that alludes to tears, and it's not completely not there, I would say.
But excuse me, I'm sorry, as a way of making her lean towards this classical, traditional idea of how she should have, what you said, of how she should have reacted in the scene, but actually hasn't. And maybe also because of what you have said, and I have loved your comment, that actually she isn't crying, but she would have loved to cry, maybe. And if we get this comparison of tears and semen and sexual pleasure, etc., actually, if she had cried, maybe she would have loved or liked what had happened, but it wasn't the case. So maybe it's also a way of just like a reading lens, you know, like a reading lens through which Anna is deprived of her status as a character who actually goes against all the expectation, all the reader's expectations, just as you have explained.
Yeah, definitely.
And what's wonderful is that you both spoke of reader's expectation and of what one can read into a text, and how one, be it a reader or an author, how one is willing to repair or to rewrite something that has already been written. And it's wonderful that you have spoken of fan fiction, because I have also thought of it when Victoire quoted the readers' reactions of the 19th century to this chapter of Tolstoy. Is as though all of these critics and readers, who are also readers of course, wanted to write their own version of the story, their own version of the chapter. So it really goes to it really makes think of the literary process also as a lot of times a fan fiction. So every writer writes kinds of fan fictions of other writers and finds like crevices in texts to fill in. But
the feuilleton forms totally encourage that, because you don't know when the novels begin, you don't know where it's going. So, for example, I totally agree with what you said, like criticism as fan fiction. When you read the early critics of the first installment, they all imagine what is going to become of the novel with Stiva as the main character. So it's really, really funny. And it's not, I mean, it could be an interesting variant, actually. And yes, so you project yourself. But at the same time, I'm really struck by the fact that we have this impression that there is a lot of time between these installments, but not so much. You know, like Tolstoy is writing to Katkov mid-February, and the installment is published 2 weeks after, and then the criticism comes, and then the third. It all goes quite quickly. So maybe it's another point of comparison with the fan fiction, is that it's not instantaneous like the internet, but it's like a continuous flow of texts.
What do you mean instant? Fan fiction, it's not really instant.
But you have this impression, you write and it's published, it's online.
Yes.
You have.
Well, it depends. You can write and then. Well, it depends.
A great example of it, there are 2 volumes of letters written to Eugène Sue about the mysteries of Paris.
Yeah.
And you know, some of them think the characters are real, like you know, have Rodolphe give me money, but the other ones that you should do this, you should do that, right?
Yeah, and for Balzac as well. There is a famous study by Judith Lyoncan about the female readers of Balzac, who actually try to correct him because it does not know exactly what female experience is. So it's very funny.
I have a few other comments, but I would like to save them for later and give the microphone to the public if there are any questions or comments or remarks. Yes. On Zoom, maybe?
I see there are some comments on the chat, but... sorry, the slides were frozen for the Zoom participants. I'm very sorry, I didn't see that in the chat.
Le partage est toujours activé. Yes, we can. Maybe we can. I don't know. Yes, but here, we can see the slides on Zoom. We can deactivate the share. Okay. Okay. Well, whilst you're thinking, I have a small comment on Eric's paper. Which I have also loved very much on this idea of interaction between the character, the unknowing character, and the reader and the author, and this very Nabokovian, of course, a way of sending signals to the reader that he knows or should know more than the character, and that the character becomes. Is like the fool of the story. I'm referring to the beginning of your paper on the death of Chernyshevsky, for instance. I had actually 2 things I wanted to say. The first one is you have mentioned Andrei Zorin when you commented on Victoire's paper, but you haven't mentioned him in your own. He has famously, or not famously, but he has authored a series of conferences on Arzamas lately, based on his most recent biography of Tolstoy, that is called Epiphanies in War and Peace. And I haven't listened to them yet, but there are 4 lectures, and all 4 of them deal with different kinds of epiphanies. And so I think it would be very interesting to compare your thoughts on the thing, because you have also talked about epiphanies of the characters and of course, the authors. And so some of them, I think, will come in resonance with what you have said. There is the epiphany before nature, or of nature, of course, is the scene of Prince Andrei before the oak. The epiphany also of, I know the last one I haven't, the epiphany of love relationships, and also one that could be of interest pertaining to the last scene you have quoted from Proust, when Marcel is in the library, is the epiphany of art. So Zorin deals with the famous passage in which Natasha dances, and so not Natasha dances. I'm sorry, this is the other one, in which Natasha sings. So it's the song as art and the epiphany of art, and so it's the idea of an ecstatic experience, which you also find in Proust. And also there was another very small thing that I read with very much interest. Well, 2 of them. When you mentioned how Nabokov commented on the translation of Proust by writing in the marginalia, idiot, etc., etc., that was I was struck with the idea that he was reading Proust in English. I believe for the course he was teaching, but do we have any account on his, except what you have already said in the letters to Vera, on his account of reading Proust in French? And what can you tell us maybe a little bit more about this relationship to the translation? Because Nabokov himself, of course, was also a translator. And what are specifically the maybe the parts he criticized in the translation, and why? And yeah, that's it. And then maybe I have another.
Yeah, I don't have the the parts written down here, but he clearly has the original French text next to him, because when he writes idiot all the time in the margin, and then sometimes he'll write in what he thinks is the correct translation. But the archive does not have, as far as I know, whatever French version, whatever, there was a play-out edition, but that was later in the 50s. So I'm not sure what edition of the French edition he was using. He clearly was reading Proust in French in the 20s, because there wasn't a Russian translation, and I don't think he was reading the English at that point. Yeah, I don't know if there's a specific theme to the mistakes. I think he was just delighted to seize upon them and to write. This is yes, this is But some translators, like I don't know. So like Robert Chandler is happy to talk about the good things that other translators do, right? Rather than focusing on the bad things that they've done. And Nabokov had this kind of gotcha sense of reading this translation for weaknesses rather than anything else.
The 4 or 5 pages he consecrated to the translation of the word Poshlost in his essay on Nikolai Gogol, and what he seems to be the almighty God. He knows all, and it's strange that he wants to find just one translation for the word, which is such a vast span, but it presents 10, 12 possibilities. Especially, if you see Gewalt Poshlosti. To me, in my mind, when I was a child and heard that very often was parler pour ne rien dire.
Well, he also manages, you know, this word poshlost that was used by like Merezhkovsky to talk about Gogol, and but Nabokov makes it his, you know, like he sort of puts his imprimatur on this, so no one can talk about poshlost now without talking about Nabokov, right? Even though it's about Gogol. But he also, in his translation of kind of terrible translation in many respects of Yevgeny Onegin, right? He turns other translators into characters. He gives them epithets like, you know, the hopeless Miss Hapgood, right? You know, and there's just this delight in other people's mistakes.
Well, thank you very much. Other questions or comments? No? Everyone is so starstruck by your two papers. Other questions on Zoom? No? I had a slightest tiny, it's not even a remark, it's just something I was very happy to find in your talk, Eric, at the very beginning, the mention of Tolstoy's death as a point in time from which to count literary history, and I think it's striking how and then you developed the idea with the quote from Aldanov, yes, who answered the
or Ivanov, probably. Georgy Ivanov, who says about him, talks about him fading.
No. The previous quote. When I'm very sorry, I'm finding it.
Oh, there hasn't been a psychologist in world literature equal to Proust since the death
Mark Aldanov.
of
Mark Aldanov. Yeah. When you say that the Russian Immigrant Journal Numbers issues a survey. Surveyed Russian writers talking about Proust, etc. So, and Mark Aldanov, you say, quote, there hasn't been I'm sorry, this is what you have quoted, I'm tired. There hasn't been a psychologist in world literature equal to Proust since the death of Tolstoy. And it's not as striking as the Nabokov's epigraph 3 years after Tolstoy's death, but it's striking as how 1910 became, for these writers of this generation, a turning point in history, or maybe even, like, you know, the year zero, the beginning of a new era. And if you think about it, they were not the only ones. If you think of Alexander Blok's, for example, famous article on the 3 deaths of Tolstoy, Komissarzhevskaya, and Vrubil, for him, in his symbolist mind, it was the end of an era. And so, but I think we often think of the end of an era of 1910, but we seldom think of it as the beginning of a new time frame, of a new calendar. But here, what we can see is that 1910 becomes like, the new era, the beginning of a new chronology. So it won't be before or after the birth of Christ, but before or after the death of Tolstoy.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought of this until your remark, but there's a way in which, you know, the revolution, like the French Revolution, right, they start counting again, right? So maybe there's a sense there of Nabokov that, oh, we're not going to count from 1917, we're going to count from 1910.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so this is what led me to think that, well, I haven't invented the thought, of course, but that literature has its own chronology, its own internal chronology, that we often, when we write histories of literature, and especially of Russian literature, because of the specifics of the Russian literary history, we often determine the place of writers and books and genres and streams, etc., by historical turning points, by historical dates. So we say the literature before the revolution, after the revolution, even though it has been a few years, if not a few decades, since that we're not supposed anymore. We're supposed to bridge the gap from before 1917 and after 1917, because there has been a lot of great academia works that has shown that 1917 is not really a turning point in literature and culture as much as it was in history for us, modern readers. But usually when authors suggest alternative chronologies for the history of literature, and I'm trying to remember, Victoire, but you know this very well, the name of the author of the world literary history or French literary history, who suggested to read literary history not from historical dates, but from dates, from literary dates, from dates of published books and literary.
Denis quelque chose?
Yes, yes, I have it in the text I have written a few years ago. Denis Tellier?
No, it's not Denis.
Well,
we will find it.
We'll remember it just in a few minutes. But yes, there has been a book that has suggested that...
Denis Ollier.
Ollier, thanks. A new history of French literature, yes, that works through the history of French literature through dates suggested by literature itself. So the publication of books, the deaths or the births of writers, etc., etc., etc. So going away from the historical and political usual practice of writing literary histories. But here, it's another thing entirely, I believe, because here is the readers, again, it's the readers, not the critics or not the historian way of looking at things. It's an internal chronology of the actors themselves, of the literary process. And I think that if you think about it, you can find a lot of examples of this, and especially in the 1920s. As I'm saying this to you, I'm thinking of Yuri Tynyanov and his idea of pромежуток, of the interval, and his idea to bend time, because as you remember, I'm sure, Tynyanov in his series of articles on the 1920s compares what is happening in the literary process of the 1920s with what was happening in the literary process of the 18th century, and brings together Chlebnikov and Державин. And so time bends, and this bending of time and this new chronology, I think it's one of the ways actually to look at literary history also, you know, but from like an internal perspective. And because Denis Ollier's endeavor, it still is an external perspective on literature. But this is, yes, that's a comment you
right.
see from
And if one reverses the chronology, then you can, yeah.
So thank you so much.
Yeah.
So,
No, go.
It's quite short, my question.
Even so.
Hi, thank you so much for the conference. I enjoyed very much. I was wondering why the final chapter of the Tolstoy novel was refused by the editor because he considered as being unpatriotic in the context of the Russian-Turkish war.
It's just because Vronsky goes off to war because he's sad about Anna's death. And it was, Katkov actually reacted very negatively to this idea because everyone, you know, was throwing about texts about how we should all unite against Turkish enemy. Dostoevsky did that a lot. And Katkov was a bit disappointed that the Russian-Turkish war was mentioned in Anna Karenina through the prism of a man who just wants to go on military suicide and does not take the war really seriously.
He also justified, that is certainly his primary reason, right? But he also said, with chapter 7, part 7, the novel is essentially over, right? So he didn't, and legitimately maybe he could say that chapter 8 is not, part 8 is not part of the novel, right? The novel itself has ended. And he says at one point, how can it be that the news of Anna's death has not reached the countryside in the Lyoven estate? You know, nobody talks about her there. Nobody, you know, the novel's called Anna Karenina. So you know, we would say that's Tolstoy's innovation, right?
Yeah.
But Katkov maybe more traditionally thought, you know, this is bad, right? It just aesthetically doesn't work.
And there is this very funny comment, response of Tolstoy saying, I could have just written, it's a story of a woman and she runs under a train and that would be over. So he gives a very, you know, like Twitter-like resume of his novel for Katkov and saying, yeah, maybe I bothered too much in writing all these pages. I could just write this and you would be satisfied because that would be totally consistent and realistic. So it's really a funny exchange between the two.
I was thinking more about this aggregation thing. You know, I mean, there's what's really disturbing about that is that presumably the people who give the questions are also maybe the judges or the evaluators. And that then, you know, I could see that the point is that women taking this exam, or anyone taking the exam, if they raise the question of rape and argue with it, they will receive bad grades, right? So, you know, if one could see cases in which that passage was given, right, and then you ask the students to comment on it, and they have, you know, free will to do what they want. And there's the Pushkin poem, Нет, я не дорожу мятежным наслаждением, about that. It's better when women resist and then they cry, right? That there's so many treatments of that scene that go out of their way, that poem, to say, of course it's not rape, right? But if it's, of course it's not rape, why even raise it? And there are, you know, cases of, one colleague told me that there was a professor who, in his Pushkin course, had female students read that poem, right, as a kind of, you know, and there you see a sort of violence that demonstrates that what's supposedly not there is there on some level.
Yes, this is something that we cannot avoid in teaching practices.
Yeah.
No, you have students who would react to this kind of themes. And for the aggregation, I totally agree that it's like a rite of passage because some thought that giving this text at the exam was like a blunder, but I'm not sure it's a blunder. It was like, if you see a rape, you're not going to be a professor of literature, because this is not what professors of literature do. But I do believe that the students who now became colleagues, for some of them, have changed the picture, because now it's, I mean, it does not mean that you're completely blind to literary processes, that, for example, when a rape comes up in classical literature in a comical form, which happens a lot, it does not mean that you turn away and throw the book away in horror, but still you can raise the question of reader response. It's just this kind of frame which is quite new in French literary criticism, I would say.
But I think in light of what has been said today, it's perfectly normal, and it's perfectly normal to acknowledge the reader's response. I think literature works this way, and this is what we have seen from both your papers, that without the reader it's incomplete. So having a reader, and various readers actually, read a text in various ways and through different lenses, is also what gives the text its meaning, or meanings. So I think it's perfectly stupid to assume that if one sees rape in André Chénier's text, is not deemed to be a professor. Yeah. On the contrary, one should be able to adopt various perspectives and various readers' points of view on a text. I think it's the open text strategy and aesthetics that we should all strive for.
And I would also have just a quick comment about Tolstoy's death, because you are perfectly right. All you said it was very insightful. I do believe that there is something very special about this date, because all the Smert poètes in history of Russian literature, it's more about, you know, life being cut short before that time. And with Tolstoy's death, it's a mixture of something being very actual because you have all these cameras and journals, etc. But it's almost like Tolstoy had died 30 years ago. I mean, he's still there, he's doing something else, he's making literature alive in another way. But to some extent, he represents something which is over, which has been over for the past 20 years. So it's really bizarre that people are also crying after the ghost of something which he was, I don't know, embodying at some point.
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right, and I think it's a complex phenomenon because it's actually absolutely an unromantic death. So on the opposite of romantic deaths of poets who died too young for their age, Pushkin, Lermontov, of course, he died very, very old, and everyone was thinking, oh, why isn't he dead yet? But the trope also, I'm only in the beginning of my research on the subject, but I'm finding a lot of this actually very common trope of saying of someone that he is dead just to say that he's old news and that his work is no longer modern enough. And so, you know, in Russian culture, it actually comes up quite often. You know, after the revolution, for example, there were soirees dedicated to dead poets, but actually who weren't really dead yet. Yeah, but they were just this way criticized and pushed aside of the literary process. Like, for example, Fyodor Sologub was dead. But I have discovered very recently, and I think this is common knowledge, I haven't seen it before, that in the beginning of the 19th century, for example, in the society, Arzamas society, the young poets, then Zhukovsky, Pushkin, etc., they also had the same funny trope of calling their colleagues dead if these colleagues were not, either did something that was deemed unworthy of a poet or were casted aside the literary establishment. And so this is, yeah, as a writer, Tolstoy had died already, as you have said, as a novelist, but also not exactly.
Yeah.
And also, the last thing is that, yes, it's an unromantic death because he died very old, but it's also very modernist death because he did this gesture, his poetic gesture, and actually his death is one of the most poetic ones because he did this gesture of going away, of uchod, and his uchod is this modernist. It was also seen and can be seen as this coming to life of this modernist trope of joining life and art. So I'm going out of the art word and going back to life, but actually by doing so, I am creating an art gesture. It's Жизнетворчество, so it's the creation of life. So actually his death is very, very modern also in this way. So it's a complex set of things.
Yeah, and it is particularly bizarre since Nabokov hated the later Tolstoy and is very vehement about that it just shows how important it was for him to establish Tolstoy's priority over Proust that he wrote 3 years after Tolstoy's death, because he could have written, 38 years, 37 years after the publication of Anna Karenina, right? But the death of Tolstoy was more of a, yeah.
The death as an artistic event,
Right.
as a literary event. It's not only as a media event. There's a book on Tolstoy's death as a media event, but it's literally a poetic death, so, or a literary one, since he wasn't a poet. Yeah, well, we have 4 minutes left. If anyone's a little energy. And if not, you're all welcome to join us for a quick, and not quick, but small, very small bite, courtesy of, which I have forgotten to say in the beginning, Strasbourg University and VICTOIRE, who has made it possible for us to have a cameraman who has recorded this whole session, and to have the short buffet that is waiting downstairs, or that is waiting in the fridge, and that I will put downstairs in a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
And bravo.